The night the world changed, it smelled of burning timber and cold water. Lake Town sat on its pilings like a city that had always known its death was coming from above. The Long Lake in late November is not the Long Lake of warmer seasons. It is black water and cold fog, the surface barely lit by the fires already crawling the western quarter of the settlement. Smaug had made his first pass 7 minutes ago. The screaming had stopped in that quarter. What remained was the deep orange underlight of things burning slowly, and the sound of water meeting flame at the edges of the platform city, and the specific silence of a population that has run out of direction and found itself in the second kind of fear, the kind that goes quiet. Bard the bowman stood on the pier. He had not run. There are men who run from dragons, and men who do not, and the distinction is not courage exactly. It is closer to the particular arithmetic a man does in his head when he knows what he is carrying and what it is for. Bard knew what he was carrying. The black arrow, black-shafted, dwarven-forged, old, his father's fathers. An heirloom so old that the word heirloom barely contains it. It was more accurately a covenant between a lineage and a single specific purpose. He had never fired it. He had never needed to, and he had always suspected he would know when he did. The thrush came in low over the water, angling against the updraft of heat from the burning west quarter. It landed on Bard's shoulder, not gently, in the way of trained birds, but with the deliberate insistence of a creature carrying a message too urgent for ceremony. It pressed its beak to his ear. Bard did not understand the language of birds as a general matter. This particular thrush was carrying speech from a particular source, a hobbit, in the mountain who had found something in the dark, on a dragon's underbelly that no scout and no army had ever located. One scale, left breast, an irregularity in the gemstone crust, a gap the size of a thumbnail, where the hide beneath was unhardened and soft as the skin inside an elbow. Bard stood very still for 3 seconds. Around him, the pier shook under the weight of people fleeing north. No one stopped at the sight of a single man notching an arrow on a burning dock. There was no reason to stop. There was no plan anyone else had that could possibly matter. He drew. The black arrow seated itself against the bowstring with the particular sureness of something that has been waiting for this exact moment since it was made. The bow was old yew, oiled until the grain was dark, the pull measured for a man of Bard's build, and a range he had walked in his mind 100 times without knowing it. Smaug came on from the north. The size of him from below is something no account in the histories of the Third Age fully conveys. The wingspan alone was wide enough to swallow the shadow of a village. His fire had been going for 12 minutes, and the heat still pouring off him at altitude was enough to steam the lake's surface at 40 feet of distance, not from direct flame, but from proximity to a creature whose body temperature in flight exceeded anything the air over Lake Town had ever held. His scales caught the firelight of his own destruction below and threw it back in gold and amber and the deep red that turned almost black in the gaps between the plates. He was banking east, turning back toward the mountain. The left breast rotated into alignment as the arc brought his underside to the precise angle that a bowman on a burning pier at the Long Lake's northern reach could, theoretically, place an arrow into. Bard calculated the updraft of Smaug's own breath. The convection column already pushing the pier's smoke west, that would push an arrow east, 8 degrees of correction to the left of visual center. He calculated the distance. The fall of the arrow over that distance. The pull required to compensate. He did all of this in the time it takes a heart to beat twice. He fired. The black arrow moved true. Every account reconstructed afterward, from the thrush's testimony, from the reports of the 2 men who saw it from the northern watchtower before the watchtower ceased to exist, confirmed that the shot was perfect. The angle was correct. The correction was exact. The arrow flew in a straight line from Bard's bowstring to the precise scale edge that the hobbit had located in the dark, on his hands and knees, with his ear against the warm stone of a dragon's belly. It was a perfect shot. It found its mark exactly. In the 6 months between Bilbo Baggins's visit to the hoard and this night, Smaug had slept. He sleeps on his gold, and the gold moves under his weight, and the gems in it press into the scales of his underside, not breaking them, but filling the gaps between them. A ruby the size of a closed fist, deepest red, from Erebor's innermost treasury, had been worked by 171 years of the dragon's mass into exactly the place where the thumbnail-sized irregularity had been. It had filled the gap as completely as if it had always been there. It had been working itself into position for decades. Bilbo had not seen it. He had found a gap, measured it, reported it accurately. He could not have known it had closed. The black arrow struck the ruby. The sound was not what an arrow makes when it finds soft flesh. It was the sound a blade makes on bedrock, a crack, high and flat, that carried over the water for a quarter of a mile. The arrow did not deflect cleanly away. It shattered at the head, the dwarven shaft splitting along its grain, the pieces falling in a shower of black splinters into the long lake below. Bard lowered his bow. He had no second arrow. He had never intended to need one. Smaug completed his turn. The great head came around, and the eyes found the pier, and the pier discovered what it meant to be seen by something that notices everything. Bard did not move. His quiver was empty. His bow was in his hand, and it was a stick of old wood. He stood on the dock and waited with the particular stillness of a man who has used his last card and is simply waiting for the table to clear. He died as well as it is possible to die in a losing cause, which is to say, standing, facing what killed him, with nothing left to do and no illusions about the fact. The fire came. The dock went. The long lake received the full fury of a dragon's exhalation in November cold, and the steam rose high enough to be visible from the eastern ranges of the Misty Mountains. The fish surfaced belly up for a mile in every direction. The timber pilings of the entire settlement went below the surface in minutes. Lake Town ceased to exist in the specific way that only fire can end a city built on water, completely, and below the waterline, and without debate. Smaug turned back toward the mountain. He knew the dwarves were inside. He had always known. He sealed the front gate with his body and rested his head on the stone and breathed slowly in the dark, and the cold air around the gate grew warm. And the mountain became again what it had been for 171 years, his. Somewhere behind the sealed gate, in a side passage 200 feet from the main treasury, a small figure stood very still in the shadow, invisible, breathing carefully, not yet understanding that the people who were supposed to come were not coming, that the plan had ended on a pier in the dark, that the world had just become a different world, and the change had made no sound louder than an arrow breaking against a stone. Stone carries sound differently than air does. In air, a sound travels outward from its source and disperses, thinning at the edges until it becomes nothing. In stone, a sound travels through, conducted along the grain of the rock, arriving at a listener's ears not from a direction but from everywhere simultaneously, as if the walls themselves have learned to speak. The architects of Erebor knew this. They built the great chambers to amplify the king's voice. The vaulted halls of Thrin and Thrur were designed so that a monarch speaking at normal volume at the far end of the throne room could be heard clearly at the gate. The acoustic engineering of a dwarven palace is a form of authority expressed in rock. Smaug knew this too. He had spent 171 years sleeping inside it. He waited outside the sealed gate for one full day. The company inside could hear him breathing, the vast rhythmic exhalation of something enormous resting against the stone. The temperature of the gate rising 3 degrees by evening, the iron of the handles too warm to hold by morning. Thorin Oakenshield posted Dwalin at the gate with instructions. Watch the iron. When it cools, that is when to worry. Warmth meant Smaug was still outside, still patient, still choosing to wait rather than enter. Warmth, in that corridor, was the only mercy available. The iron cooled at dawn of the second day. The sound came first. Not fire. Smaug did not waste fire inside his own mountain, where the smoke would have nowhere to go and the heat would build in the enclosed stone until the corridors became an oven. What came first was the sound of something moving through the dark interior of Erebor with the specific, unhurried confidence of a creature that knows every passage, every turning, every chamber, by the memory of its own body navigating them for 17 decades. A scrape of scale on stone, low and continuous, like a ship's hull against a dock, but longer and deeper, and with the particular resonance of a body whose mass, distributed against the floor, was enough to transmit through the rock itself. Felt in the feet before it was heard by the ears. Thorin had the company moving before the sound reached them. He said nothing. He made the hand signals, formation, tight south corridor. They had 3 torches between them. He gave one to Dwalin at the back, kept one himself at the front, and let the third burn in the passage they were abandoning, because light behind them meant Smaug would know where they had been, not where they were. The mountain is large. It is not, in any meaningful sense, large enough. They moved south through the merchant halls. The vast trading chambers carved 2 centuries before Smaug's arrival, where the columns were inlaid with silver thread in the specific patterns that indicated commodity type: iron, copper, coal, gold, gem. Thorin ran his hand along one column as they passed it, the brief contact of a king touching something that belonged to his people, that smelled of old stone and deep history. That was his in every sense that the law of kingdoms recognizes, and in no sense that mattered now. The sound behind them did not hurry. It simply continued. Then the voice came. It arrived through the walls, through the floor, from no specific direction and every direction simultaneously, exactly as the architects had designed. Low, unhurried, with the specific cadence of an intelligence that has no need to shout, because shouting is for creatures that fear they will not be heard. Thorin Oakenshield. The company stopped, not by command, by the specific involuntary cessation of movement that happens when the body registers something the mind has not yet finished processing. Thorin raised a fist. Hold. The torches threw orange light on stone faces. I know your lineage and your pride. You are the grandson of Thrar, who built the Eastern Stair. You are the son of Thryn, who mapped the deep vaults and named the treasury after himself, which is the kind of thing a king does when he is proud enough to be forgiven for it. You came to reclaim your heritage. There is honor in that. Come forward and I will hear your claim. The voice was patient. It was almost gentle. It had the quality of a conversation begun at a reasonable hour between reasonable parties, and the acoustics of Erebor's halls carried it with perfect clarity into every passage the company might have been occupying, because Smaug spoke from the main hall and Erebor's stonework did the rest. Ori took a step. His foot moved before he registered the decision to move it. The weight simply shifted forward, and he was in the act of taking a second step when Dwalin's hand closed on his shoulder from behind and stopped him. Cly, on the left side of the formation, had also moved, less than a step, a lean rather than a stride, a vector toward the voice that had been arrested by Fly's arm across his chest. Neither of them had decided to go. Their bodies had found the direction of the voice and inclined toward it like compass needles finding north. Dwalin looked at his own hand on Ori's shoulder. He kept it there. Thorin did not look back at them. His jaw set in the specific way it did when he was holding several things at once: grief, fury. The particular contempt of a dwarven king for any power that tries to move his people through their feet rather than their free will, and he made the signal, move, not forward. South, deeper. They moved. No one spoke. The voice did not repeat. It did not need to. The point had already been made, and everyone in the corridor understood what had been demonstrated, not by argument, not by force, but by the simple fact that 2 members of Thorin's company had begun walking toward a dragon without deciding to walk toward a dragon. The spell does not announce itself. It does not feel like compulsion. It feels like a reasonable idea that has occurred to you independently, and it is already in your feet before it reaches your mind. They found the Hall of Thryn in the 3rd hour of the retreat. The treasury is the deepest permanent chamber in Erebor, 300 feet below the main hall, accessed by a single stair carved from the living bedrock, its ceiling lost in shadow above torchlight, its floor an accumulation of 7 generations of dwarven craft and conquest and trade. The Arkenstone lay among the upper courses of the hoard near its center, not marked, not elevated, simply present in the way that the most remarkable thing in a room is present, the one object that catches torchlight and does something other things do not do with it. Thorin walked to it. He picked it up. It was smaller than he remembered. He had been a child when he saw it last. And the memories of children are not accurate measures of stone, which stays the same size while the child grows. But in his hand it caught the torchlight and divided it into something that had no right to exist inside rock. And for one moment, in the deepest chamber of his killed kingdom, surrounded by the last 12 of his people, Thorin Oakenshield held the thing his family had defined themselves by for 200 years. The sound of Smaug on the stair was immediate and final. No flourish, no speech. The dragon did not need acoustics when he was in the room. He gave Thorin what he came for. He died as a king, in his hall, with the stone of his people in his hand. Smaug was, in this specific matter, precise. He granted the death quickly, which is the only consideration a dragon extends to a king it has decided to respect. And it is not warmth, but it is acknowledgement, and in the last 10 seconds of Thorin Oakenshield's life, it was enough. The company died. They did not all die quickly. The specifics are the business of Smaug's accounting and not of this history. In a side passage off the mid-level corridor, 160 feet from the treasury entrance, a figure the size of a large child stood invisible against the stone. He had been breathing in controlled measures for 3 hours. He had followed the company's retreat by sound and fallen behind at the treasury stair. Not from cowardice, but because the part of him that had lived longest in dark places underground had understood, with an older instinct than the hobbit part of him, that the stair was a terminus. Bilbo Baggins pressed his back to the wall and did not move. Below him, after a long time, the mountain went quiet. He heard, distantly, the sound of an enormous body settling onto stone. And then, as if a furnace door had been shut at the center of the world, the temperature of the corridor fell several degrees as whatever had been holding heat inside Erebor chose to rest. He was alive. The ring was on his finger. The mountain was sealed. He was completely alone, and he knew it. The man arrived at the edge of what had been Dale on a Tuesday, which is the kind of detail that history does not record, and which matters only in the sense that the world continues to organize itself into days and weeks, even when the events inside those days have ceased to fit any ordinary calendar. He was alive. This was notable. He had been alive for the entire journey from the southern edge of Mirkwood across the ruin of Dale's northern approach. Through 3 miles of territory that had belonged to no one for 6 months and now belonged, in the specific and uncontested way that things belong to forces of nature, to the dragon in the mountain. He had been alive because he was carrying a message, and the message was carved in obsidian, and the obsidian had been given to him by a Nazgul who had explained, in the particular tonal register of something that has no breath but finds breath unnecessary for the communication of threat, that he should deliver it, and that the delivering would protect him, and that the not delivering would result in conditions he would find instructive. He left the obsidian tablet at the gate. He did not knock. He placed it against the stone, took 12 steps back, and sat down in the rubble of Dale's northern market to wait. Because he had been told to wait, and the alternatives to doing what he had been told were all significantly worse than sitting in cold rubble. 3 Nazgul arrived at dusk. They came from the south on fell beasts, not the enormous winged mounts of the later war, but the same order of creature, vast, membranous winged, their hides the color of old leather left in the rain, their eyes set flat on skulls that moved with the loose, patient articulation of something that has no musculature of fear. The fell beasts of the 9 are not natural creatures. They are old, older than the Third Age, and their relationship to the world of light and warmth is one of fundamental alienation. They do not fear darkness. They do not fear cold. They exist in the same register as their riders, shadow things, operating in the gaps between what is present and what is felt. They landed 200 yards from the gate and waited. The obsidian tablet remained against the stone. The mountain was still. It stayed still for 3 days. On the 2nd day, one of the fell beasts made a sound, not a cry, but a subsonic exhalation. A pressure rather than a pitch, felt in the chest before the ears registered it. The Nazgul holding its reins applied correction without visible effort. The beast subsided. On the 3rd morning, the man from Dale, who had continued to sit in the rubble with the specific patience of someone who has run out of options and found it clarifying, noticed that the temperature around the gate had been rising incrementally since sunrise. Not from sunlight, the eastern face of the lonely mountain in winter receives no direct morning sun. From inside. The gate opened. No mechanism operated it, no winch, no counterweight. The stone moved because the stone was pushed, from within, by something that found the gate's weight irrelevant. The block that Smaug had used to seal the entrance was 40 tons of dressed granite, and it moved aside like a door on a hinge, grinding in a straight line across the approach until it stopped against the mountain face with a sound that reached Dale's ruins and echoed off the broken towers there and came back changed. Smaug emerged. The fell beasts broke. Both of them, simultaneously, with the unanimous decision of creatures whose instincts are older than their conditioning, lunged away from the gate in opposite directions, wings beating at full extension, the ground beneath them cratered by their departure. The Nazgul held. This was not courage in the mortal sense. It was the specific endurance of beings whose relationship to self-preservation is academic. They cannot die in any ordinary way, and so the terror their mounts expressed was information to them rather than contagion. They held the reins. They pulled the fell beasts back to ground. It took time, and it was not elegant, and Smaug watched the entire process with the settled attention of a creature logging useful data. The fell beasts of the Nine, in the presence of a living fire drake at 60 feet, could not hold their positions by instinct. They could only be held by the will of riders who had transcended the instinct the beasts were acting on. This was worth knowing. Smaug was 60 feet at the shoulder, approximately. Length, tail to snout, was considerably more. He had not extended his wings. They were folded against his spine in the specific posture of a creature that is making a point about not needing to make itself large. He did not need to make himself large. He was already the largest thing in the northeastern portion of Middle-earth, and everyone present understood this, including the fell beasts. The central Nazgul spoke. Its voice was the absence of warmth given direction, not a sound so much as the negative space where a sound would be, which the listener's mind assembled into language through a process that bypassed the ear entirely. The Master of Mordor greets the Lord of Erebor. We bring terms of mutual advantage, as communicated in the, I read it, Smaug said. His voice in open air was different from his voice in the enclosed acoustics of Erebor's halls. In the mountain, the stone had amplified and directed it. Out here, in the cold of the northeastern range, his voice simply occupied the air, filled it, in the way that a large fire fills a room, crowding out the temperature that was there before. It was not loud. It was present, which is a different quality. 3 days, the Nazgul said. We waited. 3 days, Smaug agreed. I was not ready to speak. Now I am. Continue. The fell beasts were trembling at the edge of the approach. The Nazgul holding their reins did not look at them. The third wraith, the one that had not yet spoken, had not moved at all since Smaug's emergence. It remained on its mount in the specific stillness of something calculating distances. The terms were presented. Smaug listened. He was, in this, attentive to a degree that the Nazgul had not anticipated. There was no restlessness in him, no impatience. None of the performative boredom that powerful creatures sometimes use to signal that negotiation is beneath them. He listened the way a surgeon listens to a description of a case, cataloging, sequencing, identifying the gap between what was said and what was meant. When the recitation was complete, he was silent for a moment. Then he reached out one foreleg and picked up the obsidian tablet from the gate where the man had left it. He held it between two claws. The tablet was the size of a flagstone, and in his grip it was the size of a playing card, and examined it with his left eye at close range. These rings, he said. 3 of them. Your master holds them. He offers them. They are mine already, Smaug said. The statement was not aggressive. It was taxonomic, a naturalist correcting a misidentification. 3 of the 7 were taken by dragons before me. The remaining 4 your master holds only because no dragon has yet decided to take them. I will take them from him if he refuses to give them. So, he set the tablet back against the gate. What else? The Nazgul paused. This was not a pause of uncertainty. Wraiths do not have uncertainty in the way mortals do. It was a processing interval, a moment in which the communication was routed back toward Mordor through whatever mechanism Sauron's servants used to stay in contact with their master across distance. Then, the intelligence offer. The full strategic picture. Gondor's walls and their weaknesses. The White Council's decline and its political fractures. The disposition of every elvish garrison between the Misty Mountains and the sea. The march routes of the Rohirrim. The manning levels of every beacon tower between Minas Tirith and Edoras. Smaug was quiet for longer this time. The man from Dale, still sitting in the rubble of the northern market, had not moved during any of this. He was watching with the expression of someone who has been present at a historical event and cannot fully decide whether that is fortunate or not. This I could discover myself, Smaug said finally. Given time. Time, the central Nazgul said, is what the arrangement conserves. Another silence. The fell beast on the left had stopped trembling. It had gone into the specific motionlessness of a creature that has decided that stillness is the correct response when movement has no safe direction. The one on the right was still pulling slightly against its reins, a continuous low-grade resistance, like a sail under wind. Tell your master, Smaug said, that I accept the terms as stated. The rings when they are delivered. The intelligence as a continuous arrangement. The south is his business. The north is mine. We will not confuse the two. He paused. And tell him something else. The Nazgul waited. His messengers arrived on beasts that ran from me, Smaug said. The tone was not contemptuous. It was informational. the same voice he might use to note that the weather had changed. He should know that I noticed. I notice everything. If this arrangement is to function, he should proceed with that understanding from the beginning. The three Nazgul departed without ceremony. They collected their fell beasts, which required, in the case of the right-hand mount, a period of sustained physical correction before the animal would turn south. They lifted off in a single pass, low over the ruins of Dale, then climbing east, disappearing into the cloud cover above the Iron Mountains. Smaug watched them go. He stood in the gate of his mountain for several minutes after they vanished, his eyes on the southern sky, the cold wind moving across his scales in the specific way that cold moves across something too hot to be bothered by it. The fell beast's panic was information. He had filed it correctly. The nine were powerful, more powerful than anything mortal, more powerful than most things that had ever lived in the world. And they had come to him. They had waited 3 days in the cold outside his gate, and brought him terms drafted by a being who, in the long history of Middle-earth, had compelled the submission of every power he had ever addressed directly. Sauron had asked. The man from Dale picked himself out of the rubble, finally, and began walking south. Smaug did not watch him go. He had already turned back toward the gate, back toward the dark, back toward the gold and the stone and the particular quality of silence that exists inside a mountain that has decided it is no longer a kingdom, and is simply, now, a lair. He sealed the gate behind him. The long lake, 2 miles south and 20 feet lower than before, reflected the evening sky in the specific way of dead water. Flat, still, without the ripple of fish or wind. The boiled layer at the surface had separated from the colder water beneath it. Recovery would take years. Smaug had accepted terms. The arrangement had begun. He did not consider, as he settled back onto his hoard in the dark, that Sauron had also just learned something. That a dragon who names his own terms in a negotiation conducted on his threshold, who announces that he notices everything, who dismisses the seizure of 3 rings of power as a contingency he has already planned for, such a creature will eventually need to be managed by means other than negotiation. Sauron was already calculating what those means would be. The embers of that calculation would take decades to reach Smaug. Thranduil knew before his scouts stopped returning. There is a quality to the absence of information that a king who has ruled for 3,000 years learns to read the way a sailor reads the color of water. Not from any single signal, but from the pattern of what is not arriving, and when it stopped. His northern scouts had been reporting every 4th day since the fall of Lake Town. Then the 4th day came without word, and the 8th day came without word, and on the 12th day Thranduil stood in the great hall of his underground kingdom and looked at the empty doorway where a messenger should have been standing, and understood that the scouts had not failed to send word. They had failed to survive long enough to send it. He gave his orders without assembly, without the formal council that elvish custom would ordinarily require for a decision of this scale. His captains were called to his hall in 1s and 2s, as they could be reached, given their instructions, and dismissed. There was no debate. Thranduil had been present at the long calamities of the elder days. He carried in his lineage the memory of kingdoms that had ended before the age he now inhabited. And he understood what the ending of things looked like in its early stages. And he understood that the window between early stages and late stages was exactly as long as it took a dragon to decide to change direction. He gave the forest 3 weeks to prepare. He gave himself, privately, too. The wood elves of northern Mirkwood are not the elves of Rivendell or Lothlorien. They do not maintain the kind of standing archive that Elrond keeps, the long institutional memory of the Noldor in their careful libraries. What they maintain instead is intimate knowledge of their specific forest, every path, every water source, every concealed corridor through the undergrowth, every ridge from which a watcher can observe a mile of the forest floor undetected. 3,000 years of detailed territorial intelligence held in the minds of a people who do not write things down because they do not forget them. Thranduil set this knowledge to evacuation planning and gave it 1 week. The routes south were mapped, the water sources along each route were identified, the weight limits for what could be carried were calculated by the number of elves available to carry it. The treasury was a harder calculation. He took the portable elements, the carved gems, the worked metals, the specific items whose loss would be irreplaceable, and left the stone carvings, the fixed inlays, the furniture, the things that were beautiful and heavy and could not be moved without disassembly. He stood in his throne room on the last evening and looked at the carved columns that his craftsmen had taken 4 decades to complete, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say about it that needed to be spoken aloud. Smaug came from the northeast on the 14th day. He came at altitude first, a survey pass, high enough that the elves on the treetop platforms would have seen him against the sky only as a shape blocking stars, a darkness that moved with purpose. He circled the northern forest twice. This was reconnaissance, the layout of the halls below, the approach corridors, the relationship between the surface terrain and what his Nazgul briefing had told him about the underground chambers. He was not hurrying. There was nothing in the northern forest that would be more difficult to approach in an hour than it was now. He began with the undergrowth. The Mirkwood forest floor at its northern extent is dense, centuries of fallen timber and new growth compressed into a tangle of deadwood and living root, that is, in wet seasons, nearly impassable to anything without wings. Smaug did not burn the trees. He burned the floor, systematic passes at low altitude, his exhalation directed at the ground cover rather than the canopy, setting the dry material of a northern forest in late autumn alight in rings that expanded outward from his lines of flight. The trees above were bare-branched and largely resistant to direct flame. What burned was everything below them, the concealment and the undergrowth cover, and the animal corridors, and the escape routes that the forest's architecture had provided for 3 millennia. He was cutting exits, one at a time from the outside in. The wood elves on the eastern approach saw the smoke columns rising before they heard anything. The forest in that quadrant had begun to glow orange at ground level, while the canopy remained dark above it, a visual effect that experienced woodsmen know and fear. The specific sign of a fire burning in the root layer that will travel horizontally through the ground cover faster than a walking person, and without the visual warning of a surface fire. Thranduil's people did not panic. They had prepared, and preparation is the specific antidote to the kind of fear that moves in the feet. They moved on the routes they had planned, in the order they had practiced, carrying what they had been told to carry. Thranduil waited until the last company was moving before he addressed the halls. He walked through them once, through the great entrance hall, with its carved stone and its globe lights still burning, through the corridor of pillars, through the lower passages that connected the main chambers to the storage levels. He did not speak. He had said what he needed to say to his people already, and the halls themselves were not a recipient of speech. But he walked through them in the way a man checks a house before leaving it, making the inventory final, closing the record, confirming the reality of what was here so that the absence of it, afterward, would be accurately understood. The stone above the main entrance cracked at dawn. Smaug had been heating it for 6 hours. Not the entrance itself. The entrance was stone of a depth and quality that direct dragon fire would need days to breach, and he was not interested in spending days. He heeded the fault line that ran along the upper face of the rocky outcropping, the geological seam that his body memory of the mountain told him was there, a compression fracture from an old earth movement, running 40 feet across the face of the rock above the main gate. He heeded it at intervals, walking the length of his fire across it in passes, allowing the stone to cool and contract between them, cracking the seam a little further each time with the thermal cycling. The crack that appeared at dawn ran from the upper left corner of the gate faced diagonally to the lower right, passing through the carved inscription above the main arch that read, "In Sindarin, here stands the hall of Thranduil Oriferian, King of the Wood. Enter in friendship or not at all." The inscription split along the first line. The rock face above the gate sagged 2 inches, not falling but settling, grinding against the stone below it, sealing the main entrance not with rubble but with compression. The weight of the mountain's own face pressing the gate shut from outside. The secondary exits went in the next hour. 3 of them, the northern ventilation shafts, which could accommodate an elf at a crouch, and which Smaug found by the simple method of following the heat differential above the rock face until he found the points where warm air emerged. He blocked them with his tail, methodically, pressing the stone around each shaft until the rock deformed inward. The 4th exit, the southern service passage, carved at an angle for barrel deliveries, he found because it still smelled of wine, and Smaug's olfactory discrimination was sufficient to identify fermented grape must through 15 feet of solid rock. He sealed it. What remained was a hall that was largely intact, deeply underground, lit by its own internal light sources, with its ventilation compromised and its exits sealed by a dragon who had no need to enter in order to end it. The halls were not destroyed. They were simply closed. Thranduil and the last company were already in the forest river. The river runs through the lowest chambers of Thranduil's halls at their deepest point, a genuine underground waterway, cold and fast. navigable in the dark by people who know its curves and have navigated it before. In canon, it serves the barrel exit that Bilbo used to free the dwarves. In this night, it served as the last corridor out of a kingdom that no longer had any other. They waited. The water in November was cold enough to matter and not cold enough to stop them. Elves run warmer than men, a peculiarity of their physical nature that has no elegant explanation in the texts, but is consistently evidenced by their comfort in conditions that would incapacitate a mortal. Thranduil went last. He went in with the water to his chest, holding the crown of his house above his head in both hands, which was not ceremony so much as practicality. It was a wrought piece of forest imagery in silver and woodland gems, and it would corrode in river water. He held it above the current and waded through the dark while above him. At the surface, Smaug moved back and forth along the rocky face of his sealed kingdom. He emerged from the river's exit 1/2 mile south of the halls, into a forest that was burning on 3 sides and open on the 4th. He put the crown on. The retreat through Mirkwood took 11 days. They moved south and west, through the diminishing fire zones. Smaug did not pursue them into the deep forest, because the deep forest was full of spiders and other things he found aesthetically tedious, and because the elves were leaving, which was the outcome he required. They were leaving his operational area. That was sufficient. He returned to the mountain. Thranduil led his people out through the western eaves of Mirkwood on the 11th day, into the Anduin Vale under gray winter sky. He counted his people there, in the open at the forest's edge. The count took an hour. He lost no one to the fire. He lost 3 in the river crossing, a current anomaly in the lower passage, a moment's lost footing in the dark. He counted them and recorded them, and would remember them in the specific way elves remember, completely, permanently, without the mercy of fading. Then he turned west and began the long walk to Rivendell. He was not diminished. He had not been defeated in battle. There was no battle, because there was no configuration of his available forces that constituted a viable battle against what was in the mountain, and Thranduil had been a general for too long to confuse defiance with strategy. He was unbroken. His people were whole. His treasury was partial. His halls were sealed and occupied by the architecture of their own stone and whatever Smaug decided to do with them next. What he was, specifically, was homeless, and carrying a crown. He walked west at the head of his people through the gray afternoon, the crown of his forest kingdom catching no light worth catching in that weather, and behind him the easternmost trees of Mirkwood stood bare-branched against the sky, and somewhere beyond them the mountain breathed, and the fire settled, and the spiders moved already into the abandoned passages of the elvish halls like water filling a shape that has been made for it. The oldest kingdom of the Sylvan Elves in Middle-earth closed without fanfare. The wind came through its empty corridors, and the globes of light, which had no mechanism to go dark, burned on in the sealed chambers for years, illuminating nothing, warming nothing, the last automated courtesy of a civilization that had built too well to stop immediately when it was told to. Din Ironfoot received the news of Erebor's fall on a morning in December, delivered by a raven. One of the old breed, the speaking ravens of Ravenhill, who had served as messengers between the mountain and the Iron Hills for generations. The raven was the last one. It landed on the battlement above Din's hall, delivered its account in the clipped, factual register of its kind, and then sat without moving for a long time. Which is what ravens do when they have finished with a thing and have nowhere left to take the information. Din listened to the full account without interrupting. His captains were present. None of them spoke either. When the raven finished, Din was quiet for the length of time it takes a forge fire to go from orange to white. Not long, but deliberate. Then he said, "How many came out?" The raven said, "None." Din nodded once. He looked at his captains. He said, "Muster." This was the entirety of the strategic debate in the Iron Hills. It lasted approximately 45 seconds. The mobilization took 3 weeks. The Iron Hills army is not a standing force in the way that Gondor's garrison is a standing force. It is a population that is also an army. Dwarves who mine and smith and trade for 11 months of the year and pick up their axes for the 12th, when the occasion demands it. The occasion had demanded it before. Din's father had marched from these hills for the War of the Dwarves and Orcs, and Din himself had killed the Orc lord Azog at the Battle of Azanulbazar, with a strike that those who witnessed it still described in terms usually reserved for geological events rather than personal combat. The Iron Hills has a specific relationship with the concept of marching towards something terrible. It has done it before. It is not naive about what terrible means. That was the specific thing worth understanding about the muster. They knew what Smaug was. The raven had been precise. The network of dwarven intelligence that ran through the mountain clans had been precise. There was no one in the Iron Hills who believed they were marching against something that could be overcome by axework and armor and dwarven will. They knew they were marching against a fire drake whose fire had boiled the long lake and whose scales had broken a black arrow. They mustered anyway. 2,500 heavy infantry armored in iron plate, carrying axes and mattocks and the short broad-bladed swords that dwarven smiths produce for exactly the close quarters work that tunnels and mountain corridors demand. Din's personal guard was 200, equipped to a standard above the rest, plate at the joints where standard armor leaves gaps, double thickness at the pauldrons, visors with additional wire mesh backing for the eye slits. They had thought about this. Someone in the forge halls had spent time on the specific problem of fighting a dragon and had produced the best answer available, which was more iron, more layers, more protection at the vulnerable points, in full knowledge that none of it would be enough, and that the work was worth doing anyway. Din himself went on a boar. This is not a detail that requires explanation to anyone familiar with dwarven war conduct, but for the historical record, the warboars of the Iron Hills are not animals bred for appearance. They are large, heavily built, bad-tempered, and structurally dense in a way that makes them effective in the specific kind of terrain: broken rock, scree slopes, narrow mountain approaches, where cavalry horses are useless. Din's boar was old and scarred along the left flank from a previous campaign, and it moved under its rider with the settled competence of an animal that has been in difficult places before and has never once lost its fundamental opinion about being obstructed. The march west took 12 days. The road from the Iron Hills to Erebor crosses the northeastern plain, flat terrain, hard ground in winter, cold enough to make the iron of their armor ache at the joints. They moved in column, 6 abreast, the sound of 2,500 sets of iron-shod boots on frozen earth carrying across the plain for a mile in every direction. Din rode at the front. He did not speak at length during the march. What needed saying had been said at the muster. They were going because their kin were dead, and their king's mountain was sealed, and there was nothing else to do with the information that was compatible with who they were. On the 12th morning they crested the long ridge northeast of the lonely mountain, and Smaug was already there. He was on the slope below the ridge, coiled against a hillside in the posture of something that has been waiting with complete comfort for a specific arrival. Later, from the account of Din himself, who survived to give it, it would be understood that Smaug had the intelligence from the Nazgul briefing, the Iron Hills Army's muster date, its march route, its rate of travel. He had known they were coming for 11 of the 12 days they were on the road. He had chosen this specific ground, an open slope, below the ridge, with good sight lines in all directions and no terrain feature within 2 miles that an infantry formation could use for cover, and he had positioned himself at its center and waited. He did not move when the army crested the ridge. He watched them come over the rise, the dark mass of 2,500 dwarves in iron plate, the columns resolving into individual shapes as they descended, with the attention of something counting. His head did not track across the formation. He simply looked at it, the way a man looks at a problem he has already solved. Din called the halt at 300 yards. He looked at Smaug. Smaug looked back at him. At 300 yards, in open ground, Smaug's fire was effective to ranges beyond anything the dwarves' weapons could answer. This was not a tactical situation. It was a geometric one. Din understood geometry. He had built his life and his lordship on an accurate understanding of what the terrain around him would and would not allow. He did not call a retreat. The practical reality of what followed is a matter the historical record addresses in the passive voice and at speed, because the passive voice and speed are the appropriate registers for events that involve the application of dragon fire to iron plate at range. The heat generated by direct exhalation at that temperature does not require penetration. Iron at sufficient temperature conducts that temperature inward. The dwarves in the front ranks understood this in the seconds before the first pass, and did not run, because they were dwarves and the specific psychological architecture of dwarven courage does not include a mechanism for self-preservation that overrides formation discipline when formation discipline has already been committed to. The army broke in the second pass, not from cowardice. It broke because formation coherence requires that the people next to you are still standing, and the second pass addressed the flanks specifically, and the flanks were where the gap was. The center held longer than the flanks, and then the geometry became impossible, and the center also went. Din's guard held longest. The 200 in his personal company maintained their circle around him through 3 passes, an achievement that should be recorded accurately, because it will not be repeated by any mortal force in this age, and then the circle had too many gaps to be a circle and it became a last stand, which is a different shape entirely. Din charged. The record here is clear because 2 of his guards survived to give an account, and they agreed on every point. When the circle broke, Din Ironfoot turned his boar directly toward Smaug's head, kicked it to full speed, and came at the dragon with his axe at shoulder height and the specific expression that his face wore, reportedly, when he was doing something he had decided to do regardless of outcome. The boar crossed the ground between the remnant circle and Smaug at the fastest pace a war boar can sustain on rocky ground, which is considerable, and Din's axe was already moving at the angle that would have, against anything else, been a killing strike at the neck joint. Smaug moved one foreleg. He placed it flat on the ground between himself and the oncoming boar, not as a strike, not as a swipe, but as a placement. The claw went down in Din's path the way a wall goes down, without aggression, without urgency, as a simple fact of terrain. Each individual claw was the length of a sword. The foot behind them was the size of a house's ground floor. The boar stopped against it and threw Din over its head, and he hit the ground and rolled and came up with his axe still in his hand, which is a detail that tells you everything you need to know about how he spent his previous 7 decades. He was on his feet, 10 inches from Smaug's claw, looking up at the dragon's face from a distance at which the heat coming off Smaug's scales was a physical pressure against the front of his armor. Smaug looked at him. "You fought well," Smaug said. The voice at this distance was not amplified or projected, it was simply the conversational register of something that does not need to project, because proximity has already settled the question of who has the other's attention. You fought as your father's fathers fought. And it amounts to this: he did not lower his head, he did not close the distance. He simply lifted the foreleg, the wall of claw that had stopped the charge, and set it down again to his right, opening the ground in front of Din to the open plain and the remnants of his army. The gesture was not mercy, exactly. It was the specific acknowledgement that a predator makes when it has demonstrated what it came to demonstrate and has no further requirement of the demonstration's subject. Din stood in the open space and did not move. Smaug turned. He walked back up the slope toward the mountain with the unhurried deliberateness of something that has concluded a task efficiently and is returning to its next priority. He did not look back. There was nothing behind him that required monitoring. Din stood on the field for a long time. Around him, at intervals across the broken ground, the sounds of the army resolving itself into survivors. His guard, 14 of the 200, closed around him in their old formation, which now fit into a much smaller space. He counted them. He looked at the plain behind him, at the scattered iron shapes of the Iron Hills army broken across the frozen earth of the northeastern approach. He did not speak for some time. When he did, it was to his senior captain, a dwarf named Grin, who had a burn across the right side of his helmet that had fused the iron slightly and would need a forge to fix. Din said, "Count everyone who can walk. We go east." "And then?" Grin asked. "And then," Din said, "we count again." He took his axe, which was still in his hand, and he sheathed it. He turned east and began walking. He did not look at the mountain. He had looked at it enough for one day, and the looking had taught him everything it was going to teach him, and none of what it had taught him was useful yet, but he would hold it until it was. The Iron Hills army that marched back east across the northeastern plain was 843 dwarves. Din Ironfoot counted them himself at the first campfire, going through the ranks by name, because he knew all their names and the names of their fathers, and he considered it necessary to demonstrate that the knowing was intact even when much else was not. He did not sleep that night. He sat at the edge of the camp and looked west toward a mountain he could not see in the dark, and the fire beside him burned low and was not replenished. And the cold of the northeastern plain in December did what cold does. It clarified everything. Governance in the conventional sense requires administration. It requires the maintenance of roads, the adjudication of disputes, the collection of taxes, the enforcement of contracts, the appointment of officials to perform these functions in the absence of the central authority. It requires, at its foundation, a belief on the part of the governed that the authority above them has a considered interest in their continued existence and productive function. Smaug had no interest in administration. He had never had an interest in administration. The concept was not one he had considered and rejected, it simply did not exist in the architecture of his thinking, any more than the concept of gratitude or the concept of retirement. He was a fire drake of the north. He had a mountain. He had a hoard. He had, now, a northern territory that extended in every functional direction as far as anything was willing to travel to challenge him, which was not far. What he had instead of governance was presence. And presence, at sufficient magnitude, performs most of the functions of governance without any of the administrative overhead. By the 5th year, the Northern Vales had reorganized themselves. The reorganization was not directed. It was not the product of any edict issued from the mountain, because Smaug did not issue edicts. It was the product of 10,000 individual human calculations, performed by 10,000 individual humans across the villages and settlements of the northeastern Vale, each calculation beginning with the same premise, the dragon is still there, and proceeding through the same logical sequence to the same conclusion. The most important single variable in our continued existence is our relationship to the dragon, and the most favorable relationship available is one in which the dragon has no specific reason to notice us. The tribute system emerged from this calculation without anyone designing it. One village headman in the 2nd year sent a cart of gold north along the river running, not because he had been asked, but because he had calculated that sending gold was more survivable than not sending gold, and that the cost of the gold was less than the cost of being the village that had sent nothing when every other village had sent something. The cart returned empty, which meant Smaug had taken the gold and not burned the village, which was the data point the headman had been seeking. He sent another cart in the spring. Other villages observed and drew conclusions. By the 4th year, the tribute road north from the remnant settlements of the Vale was a genuine road, maintained, regularly traveled, with the specific infrastructure that develops around any route used consistently for the movement of valuable cargo. Smaug did not eat gold. He did not need it. He had more of it than the entire economic output of the northern Vales could produce in a century. But he took the tribute because taking it was correct. It was the accurate expression of the relationship, and because taking it maintained the conditions under which the tribute continued to arrive, which maintained the conditions under which the villages continued to exist, which maintained the conditions under which the Northern Vale remained a place where things happened rather than a ruin. He had, without intending to, created an economy. The headman's name was Aldrich. He was 43 years old, of the men of the Long Lake's western shore, not a Lake Town man, his village being too far north to have been part of Esgaroth's trading network before the fall, but close enough to have seen the steam column when Lake Town burned, and to have understood immediately what it meant. He was not a courageous man in the conventional sense. He was an extremely accurate man, which in the conditions of the 5th year of the Dragon King's tenure was a more useful quality. He arrived at the mountain gate on a morning in early spring with that year's tribute, gold, primarily, supplemented by 3 live cattle and a bolt of woven wool from his village's winter production, and a complaint. The complaint was this: the Croft clan, whose settlement lay 2 days east of Aldrich's village on the same trade route, had been raiding his cattle since the previous autumn. Not large raids, 3 animals here, 5 there, but consistent ones, timed to the nights when Aldrich's people were occupied with other work. The Croft clan had, Aldrich believed, calculated that the tribute road was a vulnerability. The cattle he was driving north for Smaug were visible and countable, and the difference between what left his village and what arrived at the mountain could theoretically be attributed to travel losses. He had not come to ask for Smaug's intervention. He was not naive about what Smaug's intervention would look like and what it would cost the surrounding landscape. He had come to ask for permission to retaliate, which is a different request. A request for legitimacy, for the acknowledgement that a counteraction against the Croft clan would not be interpreted by the mountain as a breach of the order that the mountain's presence had established. He made his case at the gate. He did not enter the mountain. No tribute bringer entered the mountain. Because the gate was where tribute was left, and the gate was where, occasionally, a voice came from inside that addressed you, and anything beyond the gate was not territory that the tribute bringer relationship extended to. He set out his facts in order, clearly, without embellishment, the way an accurate man presents accurate information. There was a silence from inside the gate. Then Smaug's voice, from the dark interior, at conversational volume, directed downward through the stone in the way that always made it arrive from the ground rather than from ahead of you. The Croft clan is east of the River Selduin? Aldrich confirmed this. Then they are outside the tribute road's eastern boundary. A pause that had the quality of something consulting a mental map of considerable detail. They have sent nothing. Aldrich had not known this. He absorbed it. You may retaliate, Smaug said. Use whatever force your situation requires. I will tell you one additional thing, which you may convey as you see fit. Aldrich waited. Tell them I am aware of them. The voice stopped. The gate did not open further. There was no clarification or supplemental instruction. The audience, such as it had been, was complete. Aldrich descended from the gate with his empty cart and his 2 remaining cattle. One had died on the road north, a genuine travel loss, not a raid, and he walked back down the mountain approach in the cold spring morning with the singular feeling of a man who has received exactly what he asked for and is not certain he has fully processed what it cost him. The message reached the Croft clan in 11 days. The headman there, a man named Brecca, who was somewhat larger than Aldrich and considerably less accurate, received it at his fireside from one of Aldrich's people who had been sent specifically for this purpose. The message was relayed verbatim: "The mountain is aware of you. Nothing else." Brecca sat with this for a long time. His sons, who were present, sat with it also. Outside the window of the Croft Hall, the spring evening was unremarkable. Same hills, same sky, same river sound that had been there every evening of their lives. Nothing had changed in the visible world. Everything had changed in the invisible one. The mountain had a name for them now. They were in a category, those the mountain is aware of, that was distinct from the category they had previously occupied, those the mountain has not yet noticed. The distance between those categories is not measurable in any physical unit, but it is one of the most significant distances in human experience. And the Croft clan felt it cross that evening with the specific physical sensation of cold finding a gap in warm clothing. The raids stopped, not that week, the following morning, before Aldrich's messenger had finished the return journey. Brecca sent word to Aldrich proposing a meeting to discuss the eastern boundary arrangements. The meeting occurred. The arrangements were made. The Tribute Road's eastern boundary was formalized in a compact that neither party had the authority to enforce by any conventional means, and neither party needed to. Smaug learned of the resolution through his own methods, which is to say, he did not learn of it, because he did not require the update. He had known what the outcome would be when he gave Aldrich the sentence, in the same way that a master smith knows what the metal will do before he applies the tool. The variables were not complex. A population that had organized its entire survival strategy around not being noticed by the mountain would, upon being informed that the mountain had noticed a specific element of its behavior, immediately and completely alter that behavior. The sentence was not a threat. It was not even precisely a statement. It was the application of an existing force to a specific problem, the way you redirect a river by placing a stone at the correct point in the current. Aldrich made 4 more tribute journeys in the next 3 years. He brought his eldest son on the 3rd, for the education. On the 4th journey, in a dry autumn, he brought a complaint about a well that had collapsed and taken the village's water supply with it, and whether the mountain's territory extended to the aquifer below the village, and whether Aldrich's people had the right to dig a new shaft. The voice from the gate told him, "Dig where you need to dig. The water is beneath the stone, and the stone is mine, but the water that moves through it is not mine in the sense that matters to you, so take what you need and send the usual tribute in spring." Aldrich went home and dug the well and kept the arrangement intact for another 11 years, until he died in bed of a fever, which is an outcome so statistically improbable in the 5th year of the Dragon King's reign that his son, who inherited the headmanship and continued the tribute arrangement, mentioned it to people as if it were remarkable, which it was. The world that organized itself around Smaug's presence was not a good world. It was not a just world. It was a world in which the primary fact of human life in the northeastern Vale was the location and mood of a fire drake, who had never once considered the humans around him as anything other than ambient features of his territory. Present. Functional. Too small to be worth disturbing as long as they remained organized in ways that did not disturb him. But it was a world that continued. Crops were planted and harvested. Children were born. The tribute road was maintained and traveled. The winter stores were calculated, and the summer pasture was managed, and the village compacts were made and kept, and the background fact of all of it. Present in every calculation, in every decision about where to plant and where not to plant, in every conversation about the future that any person in the Vale had in any year of the Dragon King's reign, was a mountain to the north, from which, if you listened on very still nights, you could sometimes hear breathing. The breathing was slow and regular. the rhythm of something that had found its conditions satisfactory and had no immediate plans to alter it. In the villages, people had learned to find this rhythm, distantly audible in winter when the sound carried farther, oddly reassuring, not because it suggested safety, but because the alternative to a slow, regular breathing was a faster one. And they all understood what a faster one would mean. The mountain breathed, the vale endured. The gold moved north on the tribute road every spring, and Smaug took it, and the relationship that no one had designed, and no one could modify, and no one could end, continued precisely as it had begun, not by agreement, not by choice, but by the simple, absolute, organizational force of appetite at rest in the center of everything. The distance from Erebor to the Black Gate of Mordor is approximately 1,200 miles, measured as a dragon flies, which is to say, measured in a straight line across terrain that does not concern a creature traveling at altitude, indifferent to mountains and rivers and the borders of kingdoms that have either already fallen or have not yet understood that they are going to. Smaug made the journey in 4 days. He was not hurrying. He crossed the northeastern plain on the first day, following the line of the river running south until it bent east toward the Sea of Ren, then cutting southwest over the Brown Lands, the burned and featureless waste between the Anduin and the Emyn Muil, where nothing has grown since Sauron's armies stripped it in the Second Age, and the land decided, apparently, that the effort of recovery was not worth the risk of the same thing happening again. Below him the Brown Lands were exactly what their name described, flat, dead, the color of old leather, without a single vertical feature to catch the eye. He crossed them in an afternoon and did not look down. The second day took him over the Emyn Muil and the northern approach to the Dead Marshes. He stayed high over the marshes, not from any fear of what was in them, but because the gas that rises from decaying organic matter at marsh depth is, at sufficient concentration, acidic in ways that register even on a dragon's mucous membranes, and Smaug's opinion of unnecessary discomfort was consistent regardless of the source. He saw the lights in the marsh water from altitude, the pale, cold phosphorescence that Tolkien's texts describe as the faces of the dead, visible beneath the surface in the still pools between the sedge clumps. He noted them without sentiment. The dead marshes are what they are, because a war was fought there a long time ago and was not adequately cleaned up afterward. And the failure to adequately clean up after wars is, Smaug had observed, a consistent feature of the way beings other than dragons conduct their affairs. On the third day he crossed the northern reaches of Mordor, the plateau of Gorgoroth, black volcanic rock under a sky that was perpetually overcast above the mountain range. The heat from the fissures in the plateau rising in columns that Smaug navigated by feel, using the thermals where they were useful and avoiding the sulfurous ones where they were not. Below him, the orc encampments on the plateau edges registered his presence in sequence, camp by camp, the watchfires going dark as he passed over them. Not because the fires were put out, but because the orcs maintaining them were no longer standing at their posts. He did not look down at this either. The behavior of orcs in the presence of a fire drake at altitude was information he had already acquired and did not need to reacquire. He descended on the fourth morning, from the north, in wide circles over Morannon. The Black Gate from above is a different structure than the Black Gate from the road. From the road, from the perspective of an army approaching across the Dagorlad, it presents 2 massive iron-faced towers, flanking a gate of layered iron and stone, the whole assemblage designed to communicate the futility of approach and the certainty of the defense behind it. From above it is a compressed mass of black stone and iron fitting into a gap in the Efeldath and Ered Lithowi ranges, the architecture of its defensive purpose visible as a cross-section, the depth of the walls, the arrangement of the interior courts, the placement of the orc garrisons in their tiers. The orc garrisons were not in their tiers. They were in the lowest interior court, compressed into its northern corner, which was the corner farthest from Smaug's descent path. This compression had the specific geometry of a crowd that has reached the physical limit of its retreat, and is now simply occupying the same space in increasing density. They had not fled. The walls prevented it. And the gate mechanism required operation by a garrison that was currently unavailable, so they had moved as far as the available space permitted and stopped, which was the correct tactical response and also the only one available. The 9 Nazgul stationed at Morannon held their positions on the gate towers. This was a statement, and Smaug understood it as such. The 9 did not feel fear in the way their orc garrison did. Their relationship to self-preservation was, as established, academic rather than visceral. But they had bodies, in the loose sense, and those bodies were on the towers, upright, facing his descent, which required from them something that was not courage, but was the closest available analog to it. He noted this also. Sauron had deployed his most significant agents to the gate surface specifically to be visible during Smaug's arrival. It was a display of composure. It was calculated. He landed on the Dagorlad, outside the gate. The ground beneath him cracked along existing fault lines. The Dagorlad is ancient battlefield geology, compressed bone and broken stone, and it does not absorb impact with equanimity. He folded his wings. He looked at the gate. At the gate's center, on a plinth of black stone that had not been there on the Dagorlad before this meeting was arranged, sat a palantir. It was the stone of Minas Ithil, the seeing stone that Sauron had taken from the garrison of Minas Ithil when that tower fell in the year 2002 of the Third Age, nearly 1,000 years before this meeting. It was dark when Smaug first looked at it. Then, from within the stone, a light began. Not the clear light that a palantir shows to a legitimate user, but a deep red-orange illumination, the color of iron at the point just before it reaches working temperature, building from the stone's center outward until the plinth and the ground around it were lit in that color. The voice that came from it was not transmitted through air. It arrived in the mind directly, which is how Sauron's direct communication functions when he chooses to use it, bypassing the ear entirely, arriving in the space behind the eyes as if it had always been there and was only now making itself known. "You are welcome in Mordor, Smaug of Erebor." Smaug looked at the stone for a long time. "You hide," he said. The statement went out into the air of the Dagorlad and reached no physical recipient, because there was no physical Sauron to receive it. The eye, the flame of Udin, the form Sauron had settled into since the loss of his physical body at the end of the Second Age, was not at the Black Gate. It was at Barad-dûrthr, which was visible from Smaug's position as a dark tower on the southeastern horizon, above the permanent overcast of Gorgoroth. The distance was 40 miles. "I take the form that serves my purposes," the voice in his mind replied. Its register was precise, uninflected, without the warmth that mortal speech uses to signal intent. It was the voice of an intelligence that had long ago concluded that affect was a tool to be deployed rather than an expression to be had. "As do you." "I do not hide in a stone," Smaug said. A pause. Then, "No. You do not." Something in the admission that was not concession, but was its structural equivalent, the acknowledgement of a fact that serves no purpose to contest. "I did not ask you here to discuss form. I asked you here to discuss function." The briefing that followed was comprehensive. Sauron's intelligence network, assembled over decades through the Nazgul and his eastern agents, covered the southern theater with a precision that Smaug's own observations, conducted from altitude, at speed, without the granular infrastructure of spies and informants, could not match. The walls of Minas Tirith, 7 levels, the first 5 of stone from the southern quarries, the 6th of a harder composite the Gondorian engineers had developed in the 2nd millennium, the 7th, the citadel level, of the white stone of Mindilluin, which was harder than the quarry stone but thinner. The defensive calculation of an architect who expected the upper levels to be held by garrison rather than breached by siege. The Rohirrim's mustering grounds at Edoras and Dunharrow. The signal network of the beacon fires between Gondor and Rohan. The disposition of the Ithilien Rangers, Faramir's company, their patrol routes and their safe house network in the southern woods. Smaug listened to all of it. He asked 2 questions during the briefing, both of them specific. The depth of the Anduin at the crossings between the Emyn Muil and the Pelennor, and the height of Minas Tirith's 7th level above the plain. The questions were tactical rather than strategic. He was measuring flight paths, calculating angles of approach over water obstacles, determining the relationship between altitude and effective strike radius at the target. When the briefing was complete, the stone was quiet for a moment. Together, Sauron's voice said, "We remake the world." Smaug was quiet in return. The Nazgul on the gate towers had not moved during the hour of the briefing. The orc garrison in the northern court was still compressed against its wall. The palantir's light continued its deep orange burn, patient. "You want me to do it in your direction," Smaug said. "I want us both to achieve what we each intend. Your direction and mine, in this period, happen to align. For how long?" The stone was quiet for 3 seconds. Long enough. Smaug considered this. He looked at the towers of Morannon, at the Nazgul standing on them, at the compressed geometry of the orc garrison, at the palantir's light, at the Dark Tower 40 miles southeast. He ran the calculation that a dragon runs when presented with an arrangement by a power it has no reason to trust, weighing the verifiable benefits against the unverifiable costs, measuring the intelligence value against the constraint implications, testing the agreement for the mechanism by which it would be used against him. The intelligence was real. The strategic picture was accurate in its verifiable details. Smaug had overflown enough of the described territory to confirm the broad outline. The offer of the 3 dwarf rings he had already addressed in the initial negotiation through the Nazgul. He would take them when they were delivered, and not before. The operational scope, north for him, south for Sauron, the Misty Mountains as the approximate division, suited his existing trajectory. The constraint, Sauron believed that ultimately, eventually, he would find a mechanism to direct Smaug fully. That was not a stated term of the agreement. It was present in the architecture of it, in the way that a trap's function is present in its construction even before it is triggered. Smaug recognized this. He accepted it not because he was naive about it, but because he was confident about his own response when the mechanism was eventually deployed. He was curious, in a distant way, what Sauron would choose to try. "Agreed," Smaug said. "For now." The Palantir's light diminished. Not immediately, it faded slowly, the orange pulling back toward the stone's center the way fire pulls back to its source when the fuel is removed, until the stone was dark and the Dagorlad was lit only by the overcast sky and the distant glow of Gorgoroth's fissures. Smaug lifted off. He turned north. Below him, as he gained altitude, the black gate resolved back into its aerial geometry. The towers, the walls, the compressed court, the 9 shapes on the gate's upper surface. The Nazgul watched him go. They would report to Sauron within the hour, the dragon's flight path, his departure angle, the questions he had asked during the briefing, the length of his silences, the tone of his final answer. Sauron's intelligence operation did not pause during negotiations. It continued through them. The eye in the stone at Barad Doctor watched Smaug's shape diminish northward and turned its attention to the calculation it had been running since the Nazgul's first report from Erebor's gate. The dragon was an asset. The dragon was also, clearly, a problem deferred rather than solved. Assets of this magnitude that cannot be controlled are liabilities in the making, and the history of the Second Age was substantially a history of what happened when Sauron's alliances reached the point where control became necessary and the mechanism for control was inadequate to the task. He had a mechanism. It was in the dragon's hoard. The dragon did not know it yet. The timing would require patience. Sauron had patience in the specific abundance of a being who has been planning the same goal for 3,000 years and has not yet run out of it. He turned the eye back to Mordor's internal consolidation. The southern campaign could begin at his pace. Now. With the northern theater secured by something he did not control but had, for the present, directed, in the distance, Smaug was already across the Gorgoroth plateau, climbing through the overcast, the thermal columns of the volcanic plain carrying him north faster than his wing beats alone would have managed. He did not think about the eye watching him. He did not need to think about it. He knew. The beacons of Gondor were lit on a Tuesday in March, which is the kind of detail that matters only because it is the last time they were lit for a purpose that assumed someone would answer. The beacon system, 7 fires running north and northwest from the summit of Amon Dien through Eilenach and Nardol and Erelis and Minrimin and Calenhad to Halifirion on the border of Rohan, was an engineering solution to a communication problem. How do you move a request for military aid across 300 miles of difficult terrain in less time than it takes an army to arrive? The answer the Gondorian engineers had developed in the Second Age of the Kingdom was fire on high ground, visible for 40 miles on a clear night, relayed station to station. The entire chain capable of transmitting its single message, come from Minas Tirith to Edoras in under 4 hours. The beacons went up in sequence. Amon Dien first, then Eilenach, then the chain running northwest, each fire acknowledging the one behind it and passing the message forward. The men who lit them had done this once before in living memory, as a drill. And now they did it in earnest with the specific focused efficiency of people performing a task they have practiced and hoped never to need. The message reached Edoras in 3 hours and 40 minutes. The Rohirrim began their muster. What the beacon system could not communicate, what no fire visible for 40 miles can communicate, was the variable that made the muster's timeline irrelevant. The system was designed for an enemy that traveled on the ground, at the speed of armies, along roads and river crossings. It was designed for a war of weeks, with time between the signal and the assault for a cavalry force to cover 300 miles of difficult terrain. Smaug covered 300 miles in a day and a half. He came from the northeast, following the Anduin south from the point where it bent out of the Brownlands, staying above the river, because the river was a navigational reference, and because the Anduin Valley in early spring carried thermals off the water that added 30 miles per hour to his effective ground speed without additional effort. He passed the Emyn Muil at noon of the first day, and the Pelennor fields came into view from altitude in the late afternoon, the great plain before Minas Tirith, brown and flat in early spring. The city on its spur of Mindalluin rising white and tiered above it, the Anduin silver running along the eastern edge of the plain, the brown mass of the Harlan docks visible at the river's bend. He did not descend, he climbed. The tactic was geometric rather than dramatic. At altitude, at the height where the city below resolved into its architectural components, where the tiers were distinguishable but the people on them were not, Smaug was beyond the effective range of every defensive weapon Gondor possessed. The bolt throwers on the citadel level could reach, at maximum elevation, approximately 400 feet of vertical range with meaningful force. The archers on the outer wall, the first circle's battlements, were effective to 150 feet at the outer limit. Smaug at 800 feet was in a different category of airspace entirely, unreachable, unhurried. With a sight line to every exposed surface of the city below him, and no corresponding threat from any direction. He circled once. A single pass, slow, the full circumference of Minas Tirith's tiered structure visible from above as a concentric geometry, the outermost wall, then the ascending tiers stepping inward and upward, then the sixth level's harder stone. Then the citadel at the summit with the white tower rising from its court. The white tree was in the citadel court. It was bare in early spring, the silver-barked tree of the line of Nimloth, the lineage running back through the trees of Enmenor to Celeborn of Tol Eressë, to Galathilion of Tirion in Valinor, to the light of the two trees themselves. It had been dead for 150 years, kept in the court because the tradition of the kings required a living tree, and no living tree was available, and a dead tree is at least the correct shape. It was silver-white in the morning light, its bare branches intricate against the stone of the court. Smaug's first exhalation on the descent lasted 4 seconds. The white tree burned in two. Not dramatically, not in the way that things burn in stories, with sudden engulfment and roaring flame. It burned the way silver burns when the temperature exceeds its tolerance, quickly and completely, the bark going first, the wood beneath it following without resistance, the entire structure of the tree present and then absent in a time frame too short for the eye to process as a sequence of events. The court stones cracked from the thermal shock. The tree's roots, buried in the court stone in the specific careful arrangement of something tended for centuries, followed the trunk upward in a column of ash that the morning wind took northeast. No one on the citadel level was in the court. The evacuation of the upper tiers had begun when the beacon lighter on Amundian reported, on his return descent, that the thing he had seen in the northeastern sky was not a cloud formation. Denethor, the 26th steward of Gondor, received this report in the citadel at dawn of the second day. He was standing at the window of the White Tower's upper chamber, looking northeast, when the beacon lighter's account was relayed to him by his chamberlain. He did not respond immediately. He stood at the window for some time, long enough for the chamberlain to repeat the account, thinking he had not been heard, looking at the northeastern sky, which was at that moment empty. He was not a man who showed what he thought. He had spent 4 decades in the stewardship demonstrating that the internal landscape of a ruler is not available for public inspection. He turned from the window and gave 4 orders in sequence: evacuate the citadel level's non-military personnel to the 4th tier, deploy every bolt thrower on the 5th and 6th levels to maximum elevation, open the gates of the first wall to allow the Pellennor's farming population inside, and summon Faramir. Then he went back to the window. Faramir arrived in the time it took to climb from the 3rd tier to the citadel on foot, because the stable horses had already been moved to the lower levels. He was 20 minutes. In those 20 minutes, Denethor stood at the window, and the northeastern sky remained empty, and the city below reorganized itself with the speed of a population that has spent its entire history knowing that a reorganization might eventually be required. "You should go to the lower levels," Faramir said. "I am aware of that," Denethor said. He did not turn from the window. "Tell me the state of the eastern garrison." Faramir told him. The numbers were adequate for a ground assault from the Pelennor, for the scenario the garrison had trained for the war Gondor had been preparing for. Denethor listened to the numbers and nodded once, which meant he had heard them and had already done the arithmetic, and the arithmetic had come out the way arithmetic does when the variable that changes everything is not in any of the calculations. "The bolt throwers," Faramir said. "If he comes low enough, he will not come low enough," Denethor said. "He is intelligent." Faramir did not have a response to this. It was accurate. "Go to the 4th level," Denethor said. "Organize the garrison there. The lower tiers will hold if the upper tiers can be maintained long enough to." The sound of the first exhalation reached the tower 3 seconds after the white tree burned, carrying up through the court stones and the tower's foundation in the specific way that shockwave travels through connected rock. Denethor felt it in the floor before he heard it in the air. He did not move from the window. He saw the second pass. Smaug at the correct altitude for structural targeting is not a shape you can look at directly and parse as a coherent object. He is too large, too fast, the reference for scale, the wall below him, the tier surfaces at their various heights, resolving too slowly against the speed of his passage for the eye to assemble the components into a comprehensible whole. What Denethor saw from the tower window was a shadow crossing the citadel faster than shadows move, and then the citadel's roof was open to the sky. Not collapsed, open. The distinction matters architecturally. Smaug's second exhalation was directed at the roof structure rather than the walls, because the walls were the load-bearing elements, and their destruction would bring the tier's inhabited sections down with them, and Smaug was not interested in burying the city's defenders under their own stonework. He was interested in removing cover. An army in the open, on exposed tier surfaces, with the sky directly above them, is a different military problem than an army behind walls and under roofs. He was unroofing Minas Tirith methodically, tier by tier, beginning at the top. The citadel held its walls. The tower held. The stone of Mindalluin that the citadel was carved from had a thermal tolerance that exceeded the 4th and 5th tiers' quarried construction, and Smaug's passes at the upper level, while they stripped every wooden element and opened every roofed space to the sky, did not bring the stone itself down. He noted this. He adjusted his approach angle on the 5th pass to address the joint between the 6th level's harder composite and the 7th level's Mindalluin stone, which was the structural seam where the temperature differential would be most useful. The joint cracked on the 6th pass. The 7th level's western face shifted 2 degrees from vertical. Not falling. Settling. The stone finding a new load distribution that would hold indefinitely in its current form and would become a different problem in the next winter's freeze-thaw cycle. Smaug observed the shift and moved to the 6th level. Denethor died in the citadel on the 3rd pass. He had not gone to the lower levels. He had remained at the tower window through the 1st and 2nd passes, watching the geometry of the assault with the specific attention of a man who has spent his life understanding military architecture and is watching every assumption of that architecture invalidated in sequence. He saw it clearly. He was a man of considerable intelligence, and the clarity he achieved in those minutes. Standing at the window of his father's tower, watching a dragon dismantle the city his family had held for 26 generations of stewardship, was complete and accurate and too late. The 3rd pass addressed the tower directly. The wall held. The window did not. Denethor was not burned. He died as a soldier dies, from the structural consequences of a wall that was designed for an enemy that approached horizontally and encountered one that approached from above, and it was faster than the alternative he had been calculating at the window, which was a long descent through a city being open to the sky 1 level at a time. Faramir organized the 4th level garrison for 4 hours after the steward's death. He was methodical about it. The evacuation of the wounded, the positioning of the bolt throwers at the maximum angles the 4th level's geometry permitted, the organization of the water carriers for the fires that Smaug's lower passes were starting in the market quarters. He was 24 years old, and he had his father's precision without his father's paralysis in the face of the unprecedented, and for 4 hours he made the 4th level work as a defensive position. The 5th pass went low. Smaug descended to 300 feet for the eastern market quarter, where the densest concentration of wooden structures in the lower tiers gave him the best return on a sustained exhalation. The bolt throwers on the 4th level fired, 3 of them. 2 missed the flight path by margins consistent with the problem of tracking a target moving at that speed at that angle. The 3rd was accurate. The crew had calculated the lead correctly, had fired at the right moment, had aimed at a point in space where Smaug would be rather than where he was. The bolt struck his left wing at the third joint, where the membrane attached to the leading bone. It did not penetrate. It deflected along the curve of the bone with enough force to make the wing's downstroke miss its optimal angle, which produced a slight yaw to the left that Smaug corrected within 2 wing beats. He noted the gun emplacement. He addressed it on the return pass, which ended the bolt-thrower operation on the 4th level's eastern face. Faramir died in the 6th hour, in the evacuation corridor between the 4th and 3rd levels, when the arch above the corridor failed. It was not dragonfire directly, it was the structural consequence of the 5th level's western wall losing its load-bearing function, the compression traveling down through the connected stonework to the arch above the corridor, which had held for 300 years, and held for 300 years, and then did not. The city did not fall in an assault. Cities taken by assault have a moment of breach, a gate broken, a wall topped, a point at which the defense's geometry collapses and the attacker's force pours through the gap. Minas Tirith had no such moment. What it had instead was a progressive exposure, tier by tier, roof by roof, the covered spaces becoming open spaces, the defended volumes becoming undefended surfaces, the city's 3-dimensional architecture being reduced by each pass to a 2-dimensional one until what remained was a series of stone platforms open to the sky. Inhabited by people who were doing what people do when the building above them is gone, they were going lower. The lower tiers held. The 1st and 2nd levels, built against the mountain's base, with walls of the deepest foundation stone, survived the assault intact. The population of Minas Tirith, the farmers from the Pelennor who had come inside at Denethor's order. The garrison of the lower levels, the people of the lower quarters, was alive in the 1st tier when Smaug made his last pass at dusk of the 2nd day. He came lower on that pass than any before it. 200 feet. The 1st tier's population could see him clearly from the battlements, the scale of him, the specific color of his scales in the last light of a March evening, the deliberate, unhurried wingbeat of something that is not flying hard because it does not need to fly hard. He made one pass, west to east, the length of the city's base. He did not exhale. He looked at what remained. He assessed it with the same attentive precision he brought to his hoard, counting, categorizing, measuring the relationship between what was present and what was absent. Then he turned north and climbed, and the silhouette of him against the darkening eastern sky was large for a long time before it became small, and then it became nothing. The White Tower still stood. Too much stone, too deep a foundation, too much Mindalluin in its bones for 2 days of assault to bring it to the ground. It stood open to the sky above the 4th level, its upper sections exposed, its lower sections intact. It stood the way ruins stand when they are not yet entirely ruins, with authority and without purpose, which is the specific condition of things that were built to mean something and have survived the ending of what they meant. In the court below the tower, where the white tree had stood for 150 years, there was ash on the stones. The Rohirrim arrived at the Pelennor on the morning of the 3rd day. They came over the Ramus Eker in the grey dawn, 6,000 riders, the full muster of Rohan, their horses blowing in the cold air, the ground shaking under the approach in the way that 6,000 horses at canter make the ground shake. They came as they had always come, at the speed and in the formation they had trained for the war they had been called to fight. They reined up at the Ramus breach and looked at Minas Tirith. Thodin held his horse at the breach for a long time. Around him, the riders came up behind and stopped, and the field went quiet except for the horses' breathing and the specific sound of 6,000 people absorbing information that has no immediate answer. The city was there. The walls were mostly standing. The White Tower was standing. The beacon fires on the upper tiers were out, not because they had been extinguished, but because there were no upper tiers anymore in the sense that contained beacon fires. The upper city was open to the sky, and from the Ramus breach, in the morning light, the geometry of what had happened was legible to any military man who had spent his life reading ground. Thodin read it. He understood it. He looked at Minas Tirith for the length of time it took him to complete the reading. And then he turned to his marshal and said, in the voice of a king who has arrived somewhere he was supposed to save and found that saving is now a different and harder problem than fighting, "Who is in command in there?" Nobody knew. The riders held on the Pelennor in the cold morning, and the city before them breathed smoke from its internal fires. And above the whole arrangement the sky was empty and blue and gave nothing away. The ring had been in the hoard for 78 years. This is not a long time by the measure of the things that matter in this account. It is a fraction of Smaug's tenure in the mountain, a fraction of the ring's total existence, a geological instant by the standard of the forces that made both of them. But 78 years is long enough for a gold band of unremarkable appearance to work itself down through the upper layers of a hoard, by the simple physics of being small and smooth, in a collection of objects that shift incrementally under the weight of something enormous moving across them. Smaug moved across his hoard regularly. The ring moved down. By the 78th year it was at a depth of approximately 4 feet below the hoard's surface, buried under gold coin, worked jewelry, gemstones loose and mounted, a dwarven helm of considerable antiquity, 3 ingots of a silver alloy that Erebor's smiths had developed in the reign of Thrur, and which no one alive outside the mountain now knew the composition of, and a coin of Nimmenrian minting so old that the face on it had been worn to a smooth oval by handling, the name of the king it commemorated gone with the metal it had occupied. The ring was under all of this, and it was warm. Not warm from the ambient temperature of the hoard. Smaug's body heat permeated the treasury at a level that made the gold itself warm to the touch, and had for 171 years before the current tenure began, and the warmth was consistent and sourceless, in the way of a room whose walls have been heated from outside. The ring's warmth was different in kind, specific, directional, emanating from the object rather than from its surroundings, a heat that had no physical cause in any ordinary sense, and that Smaug had noted in his first, detailed inventory of the hoard's contents and filed under anomalous. Return to. He returned to it on a morning in mid-autumn of the 78th year. He was awake, not in the half-dozing state that passes for sleep in a creature whose threat awareness does not fully disengage, but genuinely, alertly awake, moving through the treasury in the slow, deliberate way of something that is thinking while it moves. His left forelimb moved through the hoard's surface layer in the specific gesture of a hand searching a familiar drawer, not random, not hurried, knowing where to go. He had been here before. He had held the ring before, twice, in the early years. Both times he had examined it and put it down and moved on. Both times the anomalous warmth had been present and had not done anything beyond being warm. Today it was different. He found it at 4 feet of depth, his claw parting the upper layers without disturbing them more than necessary, a precision of movement that was, in its way, as remarkable as anything else about him, that something his size could sort through gold coin at a depth of 4 feet with the discriminating touch of a jeweler. He lifted the ring to claw-tip height and looked at it with his left eye at close range. It was unremarkable to look at. He had established this on the first examination, and the conclusion had not changed. A gold band, plain, unadorned, sized for a human hand, with no visible inscription and no gemstone, and no working of the metal surface that a jeweler would consider notable. It was the kind of ring a moderately prosperous man of the Third Age might wear on a significant occasion and take off afterward, present in its type in the thousands in any large hoard, distinguishable from its type only by the warmth, and the weight, and the fact that it was doing something. It was whispering, not in language. Not in any of the several languages Smaug had acquired across his centuries, not in black speech, not in the Westron that the men of the Vale used, not in the Thranduil fragments he had absorbed from Erebor's inscriptions during his first years in residence. It was pre-linguistic, operating below the level of words at the level of direction and implication. The way a current of warm air implies a fire without describing one. It pulled, faintly, toward desire, toward more. Toward the specific sensation of having everything you could want, expanded to include everything you did not yet know you wanted. Smaug held it at claw-tip and listened to this with complete attention. The whisper built carefully, the way a skilled negotiator builds a case, beginning with what the subject already values, working outward from the established ground. It spoke to the hoard. Yes, this, but larger. Not a mountain. A range. Not a range. A continent. Not the gold of one civilization. The gold of all of them, every treasury and every kingdom, brought here. To you, because you are the largest and the oldest and the most capable of holding it. Smaug was quiet. The world, the ring implied. Everything in it, every shining thing that any hand has ever made. Yours, he turned the ring on his claw tip, examining the outer surface in the torchlight. He kept torches in the treasury. Not because he needed them, but because the gold looked different in firelight than in darkness, and the difference was aesthetically worth maintaining. The gold of the ring was the same color as the gold around it. That was intentional. He had understood this on the first examination. It was made to disappear into a hoard. to be indistinguishable, to wait. Yours, the ring said again, with the specific insistence of something that has been waiting for this conversation for a long time and is now hopeful. I already have the mountain, Smaug said aloud to the empty treasury. The whisper paused. It recalibrated. It tried a different approach. The specific pleasure of being uncontested, of having no rival, of the world below the mountain quieting itself in recognition of a supremacy so complete that the word rival ceased to have reference. It painted the image of Middle-earth as Smaug's unchallenged hunting ground, the kingdoms gone, the armies dissolved, the long ages of history arriving finally at their correct conclusion. Smaug looked at the image. He examined it with the same attention he gave the ring's physical surface. He found it accurate in its broad outlines, but not interesting as an offer. Because it described a situation that was already in progress by his own means and required no assistance from an unremarkable gold band to achieve. And the world, he said, is becoming my problem anyway. He put the ring down. Not carelessly, he placed it with the same precision he used in the search, returning it to the surface layer of the hoard rather than the depth from which he had retrieved it, because he wanted it accessible, and because the depth had served a purpose when the ring's location was uncertain, and that purpose was now concluded. He wanted to know where it was. He placed it in the top layer, near the left wall of the treasury, beside the Inmanrayan coin with the worn face, in a position he would be able to locate in 3 seconds from anywhere in the hall without searching. Then he sat with the information the ring had given him, which was separate from the information the ring had intended to give him. The warmth was directional. He had felt this before, but imprecisely, as a property of the object rather than a vector pointing somewhere specific. Now, having held it while it was actively whispering, he had a clearer reading, the direction of the ring's warmth, the direction its call traveled, the axis along which its desire pointed, was south and east, toward the plateau of Gorgoroth, toward Barad Dr., toward Sauron. He sat with this for the length of time it took a torch to burn down an inch, 12 minutes, approximately. During those 12 minutes he reorganized the available information into its correct sequence. The ring was in his hoard. The ring's call went east and south toward its maker. Its maker was his current alliance partner. Its maker had, during their meeting at the Black Gate, made no mention of a ring of power that happened to be in Smaug's hoard, which meant one of two things. Either Sauron did not know the ring was here, or Sauron knew the ring was here, and had chosen not to mention it. Smaug considered both possibilities with equal attention. The first was possible. The ring had been buried under 4 feet of gold for most of its tenure in the hoard. Its warmth, which was the only distinctive quality available at that depth, might not have been sufficient to register through the stone of the mountain to a seer in Mordor 40 months before this conversation. It was possible that Sauron's intelligence network, which had produced the strategic briefing at the Black Gate with impressive precision, had failed to locate his most significant lost possession in the hoard of the most significant fire drake in the Third Age. It was possible. The second possibility was that Sauron knew exactly where the ring was and had structured the entire negotiation, the Nazgul at the gate, the terms of the alliance, the briefing at Morannon, the patience of the arrangement, around the fact that the ring was under Smaug's body, and that any approach to recovering it that did not begin with establishing a reason for Smaug not to destroy it would result in its destruction, and that therefore the correct approach was to make Smaug a partner rather than a target until the mechanism for recovery was ready. Smaug found the second possibility significantly more interesting. He did not move the ring. He did not hide it further or bring it closer. He left it where he had placed it, beside the Inmanrayan coin, in the top layer of the hoard, and he returned to his position at the treasury's center and lowered his head to the level of the gold surface and breathed slowly. The ring's warmth was present and steady in his peripheral awareness. He had catalogued it correctly. He had located it, held it, assessed it, understood what it wanted from him and declined to provide it, and extracted from the encounter information that was worth considerably more than anything the ring had offered. He knew something Sauron did not know he knew. That was a ledger position he had not held at the Black Gate, and the asymmetry of it was, in the specific way that Smaug found asymmetries satisfying, deeply comfortable. He settled into the hoard with the long, controlled exhalation of a creature that has finished a piece of work and finds the result acceptable, and the gold shifted around him in the small avalanche of sound that gold makes when something enormous adjusts its position in a treasury, and then the mountain was quiet again. The ring sat beside the Emanrayan coin and continued its warmth. It had no mechanism for patience in the way that Sauron had patience. Its wanting was continuous and undimmed by the encounter's failure. Its pull toward its maker as constant as the pull of a compass needle, unaffected by the fact that the needle was in the possession of something that read compasses and did not go where they pointed. It had never encountered this before. Every bearer in its history had been susceptible to corruption, to amplification, to the long working of its whisper on their desire, until the desire and the ring's will were indistinguishable from each other. Isildur had worn it and been destroyed by it. Gollum had worn it for 500 years and been remade by it. Bilbo had carried it for 60 years and felt the pull of it every decade more than the decade before. Smaug had held it for 12 minutes and put it down and gone back to sleep. The ring did not have a mechanism for this outcome. It had been made by an intelligence of vast cunning and deep understanding of the desires of the beings that inhabited Middle-earth, and that intelligence had not. In its comprehensive planning, fully accounted for the possibility of a bearer whose desire was so complete, so total, so perfectly satisfied by its existing conditions, that the ring's offer of more landed in a space that was already full. There is no purchase for a lever against a surface that has no gap. The treasury was dark and warm and full of gold, and in the top layer near the left wall, beside a coin whose king had been forgotten for 3,000 years, the most powerful artifact in the history of the Third Age sat and whispered to no one, patient as the stone around it, waiting for something to change. Nothing changed. The mountain breathed. The hoard was warm. Outside, the world continued its diminishment, and inside. In the deepest treasury of the greatest dwarven kingdom in the north, a dragon slept on his gold with one eye not entirely closed. And the ring's warmth was a known quantity in the corner of the room, and the direction of that warmth pointed south and east, toward Mordor. And Smaug knew where south and east was, and he filed this fact in the place where he filed things he intended to return to it, the moment of his choosing. He did not sleep deeply that night. He did not need to. The Shire does not appear on most maps of Middle-earth. This is not an oversight. It is a consequence of the Shire's relationship to the world beyond its borders, which is a relationship of comprehensive mutual indifference sustained over 3 centuries of deliberate obscurity. The hobbits of the Shire do not make maps of other people's countries, and have never seen a reason why other people's countries would make maps of theirs. The roads into the Shire are old and poorly maintained at their western ends, and become progressively better maintained as they approach the interior, which is the road maintenance pattern of a people who are interested in where they are going, and not particularly invested in being found by those coming the other way. Smaug knew where it was. The intelligence from the Nazgul briefing at the Black Gate had included it, a footnote in the strategic picture of the Western Territories, identified not as a military target, but as a geographic reference point. The Shire, land of the Halflings, west of Bree, north of the Greenway, bounded on the west by the Far Downs, and on the east by the Brandywine River. It had been included in the briefing because Sauron's intelligence operation was thorough in its geographic coverage, not because anyone at Barad-dûrauctor considered the Shire a significant asset or liability in the war being conducted to the south. Smaug had noted it. He noted everything. He had noted it specifically because the briefing, in its identification of the Shire's location, had also identified its most significant historical export to the relevant events of the Third Age, a hobbit named Bilbo Baggins of Bag End, Hobbiton, who had entered Smaug's Mountain in the year 2941 using a ring of unknown provenance to remain invisible, who had stolen a cup from the outer treasury, who had subsequently engaged Smaug in conversation and gathered intelligence that was transmitted by Thrush to Bard the Bowman on the pier at Lake Town. The arrow that had broken against his scales had flown because of information gathered by a creature from the Shire. Smaug did not hold grudges in the way that men hold grudges, as emotional weights carried forward through time, pulling at the carrier, demanding resolution. He held them the way he held everything in his hoard, catalogued, located, available. The accounting of what had been done to him was complete and current, and had been complete and current since the night Bard's arrow shattered. The cup was in the hoard. The Arkenstone was in the hoard. The arrow was gone, broken, sunk in the long lake, but the archer who had fired it was also gone, which was an adequate resolution of the arrow's specific debt. The cup's theft and the intelligence that had armed the archer remained on the ledger. Bilbo Baggins was dead. He had died in Erebor in the second year of Smaug's reoccupation, in a side passage off the mid-level corridor, which was the last place the accounting had him located. The debt could not be collected from him personally. But Bag End was still there. The Shire was still there. Smaug left Erebor on a morning in early November, the 78th autumn of his second tenure, 3 weeks after the Ring's conversation in the treasury. He did not announce his departure to anyone, because there was no one to announce it to. He went west over the misty mountains at the High Pass, the same pass through which Bilbo Baggins and 13 dwarves had traveled in the opposite direction 78 years before, and descended the western slopes into the gray morning of the Anduin Vale. He crossed the Vale without event. The Beornings, who had once held the river crossings between the mountains and Mirkwood, were gone. Displaced north during the early years of the Dragon King's consolidation of the northeastern territories, their settlements along the Anduin abandoned to the weather, the river crossing at the old ford was intact, the stone of it and empty, and Smaug crossed above it without interest. The misty mountains from the west present a different profile than from the east. Lower. Greener on the lower slopes, the snow line at a different altitude. The western light softer than the cold clarity of the northeastern plain. He climbed above the cloud layer over the central range, and navigated by altitude and compass sense, the magnetic orientation that fire drakes maintain with the same unconscious precision that birds maintain it. An inbuilt directional awareness that functions independently of visual landmarks. He descended on the western side into rain. The weather hills were visible through the rain in the early afternoon, their rounded profiles marking the eastern edge of the territory that the hobbits considered their general neighborhood, not the Shire itself, but the roads that led to it. Bree was below him to the south, visible as a cluster of lights in the gray afternoon, smoke from its chimneys dispersing in the westerly wind. He did not stop at Bree. He had no business in Bree. He flew northwest. The Shire appeared below him at dusk, not dramatically, not with a clear geographic boundary that announced itself from altitude, but gradually. The way a cultivated landscape resolves out of uncultivated land as you approach it, the field patterns becoming more regular, the road lines cleaner, the distribution of buildings shifting from the scattered and pragmatic arrangement of frontier settlement to the denser, more considered layout of a community that has been in the same place for a long time and has organized the land around it. With deliberate care. He circled once. A single pass, low enough to read the landscape but high enough that the sound of his wings, a deep, rhythmic concussion of air, audible at considerable distance, arrived below him as something ambiguous. Wind, perhaps. A storm coming in from the west. The Shire in early November was stripped of its summer color, the fields brown and harvested, the gardens bare-caned, the trees along the water reduced to their winter architecture, smoke from the round chimneys of the round doors, dozens of them across the hillsides of Hobbiton, the domestic exhalation of a community at supper time, filling the cold air with the smell of wood smoke and the specific comfortable warmth of enclosed spaces doing what enclosed spaces are for. He found Bag End. It was not difficult. The Baggins property was the most prominent holding on the hill, the largest smile, with the most extensive garden. The round green door at the center of the hill's face, visible even at altitude as the kind of door that has been freshly painted and maintained with the specific attention of someone who considers the door's appearance a reflection of the household's character. The garden above the Smiles Hill was bare but ordered, the canes tied back, the beds edged, the paths cleared of autumn leaf fall. Someone had been caring for it recently. Someone was in it. The Sackville Bagginses had inherited Bag End in the year 2942, when Bilbo Baggins was formally declared dead following his failure to return from the journey east. Lobelia Sackville Baggins had moved in with the specific satisfaction of someone who has wanted a thing for a long time and has finally received it through the correct channels, and she had maintained it in the correct channels ever since. Because the correct channels were what she understood, and she was, in her way, reliable, Smaug descended on Bag End from the east, coming low over the hill's crest and pulling into a tight banking turn that brought him to the garden level at the moment of his exhalation. The fire lasted 4 seconds, directed at the hill face above the round door, at the garden, at the tool shed along the eastern wall, at the gate where the garden path met the lane. Not a sustained assault, not the methodical work he had done at Minas Tirith. A single, complete, specific application of fire to a specific address. The garden went first. The bare canes caught immediately and were gone before the smell of their burning reached the lane below. The hill face above the door, the grass of it, the flower beds cut into the slope, burned in a line moving upward from the door level. The round door itself, green and freshly painted, held for approximately 3 seconds against the heat radiating from the stone above it, before the paint blistered, and the wood beneath it made its decision. The hill smile is underground. Fire travels along surfaces. The structure of Bag End, its rooms carved into the hill, its walls of compacted earth and stone, its floors of polished wood set on stone, was not consumed. The hill survived. The chimney continued to exhale the smoke of a fire that was still burning inside because no one had put it out, because no one inside had time to put it out, because the events above the door had lasted 4 seconds, and the time required to understand what was happening and respond to it was longer than 4 seconds by a significant margin. The Sackville Bagginses were in the kitchen when the door failed. They were alive and would remain alive. They went out the back passage, which connected through the root cellar to a secondary exit on the hill's north face, and they came out into the garden of the next property over and stood in the cold November dark and looked at what was happening to the hill and experienced. With complete accuracy and no useful context for processing it, the specific condition of people presented a historical event they have no framework for. Below on the lane and in the neighboring gardens, hobbits were doing what hobbits do when confronted with the unprecedented. They were gathering at a distance and looking and talking and looking again and talking again. The social instinct of a community that has spent 300 years in the same place together, with no experience of anything that required a faster response than committee formation, expressed itself correctly under the circumstances. Which is to say, it expressed itself at entirely the wrong speed for the situation. Smaug made one additional circle over Hobbiton. He looked at Bag End, the garden gone, the hill face scorched, the door failed, the chimney still smoking from the kitchen fire, the structure itself intact below its surface, because stone and earth do not burn. It was not a ruin, it was a marked address. The distinction was intentional. He turned east. The flight back over the weather hills took the first hours of the night. Below him, at Bree, the lights were still going. Somewhere on the road south of Bree, a late traveler with a cart and a pony was moving at the fastest pace the pony would sustain in the dark, having heard, from the direction of the Shire to the northwest, a sound that did not belong to the November night. The traveler did not look back. This was correct. Smaug climbed over the misty mountains in the dark, navigating by magnetic sense through the cloud layer, and descended the eastern side into the clear cold of the northeastern plain. The mountain was ahead of him, its profile black against the stars, the gate sealed, the hoard warm inside it. He came in low over the ruins of Dale, following the river running north to the approach, and landed on the Erebor gate slope with the settled precision of something returning to the only location in the world it has ever considered a destination. He sealed the gate behind him. In the treasury, the ring was where he had left it, beside the coin with the worn face, in the top layer, warm and directional and patient. He noted it in passing. He moved to his position at the treasury center and lowered himself onto the gold. The ledger was current. The specific debt that had accrued on the night of the thrush and the pier and the broken arrow had been addressed. Not with the precision of a transaction that could be closed, because Bilbo Baggins was dead and could not receive the accounting directly. But with the precision available, the address had been marked, the record corrected, the event answered. A door that had once opened onto a hobbit hole belonging to a creature who had robbed Smaug of a cup and armed an archer who had tried to kill him was no longer a door. This was sufficient. It was not satisfaction exactly. Satisfaction implies a desire relieved. And Smaug's desire was not of the kind that relieves. But it was completion, which is a different and more durable condition. He closed his eyes. Outside, the Erebor gate slope was dark and cold, and the long lake in November was a black mirror, reflecting nothing. And the ash of Bag End's garden was settling in the Shire in the quiet dark. And the field mice that lived in the lane below the hill were going about their business in the roots under the scorched earth, undisturbed, as field mice do. The thought arrived on a Thursday morning in the deep winter of the 81st year, between one breath and the next, in the specific register of Smaug's own internal voice, his vocabulary, his cadence, his syntax. The particular way his mind formed intentions before his body enacted them. The content was wrong. Take the ring south. The alliance requires it. Smaug had been half resting in the treasury, his awareness distributed across the hoard in the way it was during the lighter phases of sleep, present at every point simultaneously, monitoring without focus. The supernatural inventory sense running its continuous audit of every object in every position. The ring was in its position beside the Inmenrayan coin. The torches were at their usual positions on the left wall. The temperature of the treasury was correct. Nothing had moved. And then the thought, arriving fully formed in his own voice, with his own syntax. containing an instruction he would never have generated. He was fully awake before the thought completed itself. Not gradually, completely, all at once, the distributed awareness collapsing to a single point of absolute attention. He did not move. He lay in the same position he had occupied for the previous 6 hours, and he examined the thought from the outside. The way you examine a mark on your skin that was not there yesterday, not the mark itself, but the question of what had made it. He had never in his life had a thought that suggested he give anything to anyone. The thought had arrived in his voice. It had used his vocabulary. It had been dressed with sufficient care that a less attentive recipient might have completed the action before recognizing the instruction as external. The care was significant. It was the care of an intelligence that understood the mechanism of suggestion, that knew the difference between a command that announces itself as a command and one that presents as a natural next step. It was sophisticated work. It had lasted approximately 1 second before he identified it as not his. He picked up the ring. He lifted it from beside the coin and held it at claw tip, as he had done in the autumn of the 78th year, and he waited. The whisper began again, the pre-linguistic pull toward more, toward everything, the same approach it had used before. And underneath the whisper, now that he was holding it and actively attending, the directionality was sharp and clear. South and east. Barad doctored the eye. The connection ran along the ring's substance like a wire runs along its length, present, taut, carrying something in both directions. He could feel the other end of it. Faintly, at distance, through the medium of an artifact built to be a conduit between its maker and the world, the maker's attention, focused on this treasury, on this specific claw tip, on the object in his grip. Sauron knew the ring was in his hand. Sauron had waited for him to pick it up. "You tried to use your toy on me," Smaug said to the empty hull. The ring was silent. The whisper had stopped at the moment of his address, not gradually, but immediately, the way a caught thief goes still. The directionality remained, the connection south and east still present and readable, but whatever intelligence had been operating through it had withdrawn to a more careful distance. "And you thought I wouldn't notice." He held the ring for 3 more seconds, examining the connection. The withdrawal was complete, but the direction was exact. He had the coordinates in the specific sense that a creature with his navigational precision reads coordinates, not numbers, not compass bearings, but the felt geometry of where something is in relation to where he is, accurate to within a mile at this distance. He put the ring down. He replaced it beside the coin with the worn face. Then he stood. The decision had been made in the 3 seconds between his second statement and the replacement of the ring. Not deliberated, decided, which is a different process. Deliberation weighs options against each other and selects from among them. Decision, at this speed, is the recognition that only one option exists, and the resolution to execute it without the delay that deliberation introduces. Smaug's deliberations were extensive and careful when the situation permitted. This situation did not permit. Sauron had reached into his treasury and placed a false thought in his mind. The thought had been dressed in his own voice. It had been an attempt at control, subtle, sophisticated, the best available application of the most powerful instrument of psychic domination in the history of Middle-earth, and it had lasted 1 second. The alliance had ended in that second. The remaining question was geography. He was at the gate in 4 minutes, which is fast for a creature his size moving through mountain corridors, but not the fastest he had moved through them. He opened the gate from inside with the single lateral movement of his shoulder against the stone, 40 tons of dressed granite, the gate he had used to seal his mountain for 81 years. Moving aside in a grinding arc that scattered snow from the gate slope in a white fan against the winter dark. He went through without stopping and was airborne in the same motion, his wings at full extension on the first downstroke, the cold air of the northeastern plain accepting his weight in the way that cold air accepts large things, with resistance and then without it. He flew south at speed he had not used since the first morning over Lake Town. The misty mountains were below him before dawn, the full central range, peak after peak running north to south, the high passes marked by the absence of the cloud layer that clung to the lower slopes. He crossed them at a point south of the high pass and north of the Redhorn Gate, where the range was at its most compressed, and descended the western side in the first gray light of morning. He did not stop to assess the western territories below him. He had the direction, and he maintained it. The brownlands in winter from altitude are indistinguishable from the brownlands in any other season, which is one of the more efficient features of a landscape that has been dead for 2,000 years. He crossed them before noon. The Emmen Mule was below him in the early afternoon, the dead marshes beyond it gray and still. He climbed over the Efeldath from the west, the mountain range that formed Mordor's western wall, and came in over the interior of Mordor from an angle that no assault in the history of the Third Age had used. Because no assault in the history of the Third Age had come from above and from the northwest simultaneously. The orc encampments on the plateau of Gorgoroth saw him coming for 40 miles. This did not help them. He went east across the plateau at 200 feet, low enough to be specific, high enough to cover ground at full speed, and the encampments he passed over ceased to be encampments in the operational sense. He was not targeting them. He was traveling through them, which was worse, because targeting implies restraint and travel implies that you are simply in the way of something going somewhere and have been assessed as insufficient cause for a change of course. The orc armies that Sauron had mobilized for the southern campaign's second phase, 30,000 infantry staged on the Gorgoroth plateau, waiting on the march order, received a counter-order from Barad-dûr as Smaug crossed them: turn east, defend the tower. The order traveled through whatever mechanism Sauron used to direct his armies directly, the compulsion that his will projected over the orc kind that served him. 30,000 orcs turned east and began moving. He passed over them going the same direction. The march order's execution was at that point academic. Barad-dûr rose from the plateau's southeastern end against a sky that was perpetually overcast above it, the Dark Tower. Rebuilt to its pre-siege dimensions over the 3,000 years since the last alliance had reduced the first version of it, its upper levels lost in the cloud cover that Sauron's presence generated as a climate rather than a choice. It was vast. It was the largest single structure in Middle-earth. Built with ring power and sustained by it, its foundations sunk into the volcanic bedrock of Orodruin's skirts, its walls a composition of iron and stone that had no precedent in mortal architecture. Smaug hit it from the northwest at full speed, with the first exhalation already running. The impact was not structural. He was not large enough to physically breach a wall of that depth, and he understood this without requiring the demonstration. He came in along the tower's western face at roof height and delivered 6 seconds of fire across the upper courses of stone in a line running north to south, the fire directed at maximum temperature rather than maximum volume. The precise application of heat to stone at the thermal limit of what the stone could absorb before the crystal structure of its composition began to fail. The stone did not melt. It cracked. A fracture line opened along the northwest corner of the upper section, running vertically for 60 feet before the depth of the wall absorbed the thermal differential and held. The crack was not catastrophic. It was evidence. It was the mark of a dragon's first pass on a wall that had not been marked in 3,000 years, and Smaug observed it on the banking turn and adjusted his angle for the second pass. The 9 were waiting on the second pass, all 9 of them assembled on the upper battlement of Barad-dûr's central section in a line. Their combined presence generating something that was not physical but was felt by the body regardless. The Nazgul in isolation are shadow, powerful, cold, the absence of warmth and light given direction and will. The 9 in concert are something categorically different, their combined wraith force achieving a coherence that Sauron's binding had designed specifically for this configuration. The way 9 tones played simultaneously produce a resonance that none of them produces alone. The resonance reached Smaug on the second pass at full extension. It was not fire, and it was not physical impact. It was a force that operated on the layer of being below the physical, the spiritual architecture that underlies the body. And it found purchase in the way that cold finds gaps in armor, not through the material itself, but through the spaces between. He felt it as a contraction along the left side of his chest, not pain, which is a mortal category, but the specific resistance of something pushing against the structure of what he was rather than the structure of his body. He completed the pass. He pulled up into the climb with the contraction still present, adjusting his trajectory for the thermal differential, and circled at altitude. The 9 remained on the battlement. The eye in Barad-dûr burned in the cloud layer above the tower's summit, present, watching, not speaking. Its patience was operational rather than resigned. It was waiting for the moment Smaug tired, which was the only condition under which the current situation resolved in Sauron's favor. Smaug made 7 more passes over the next 4 hours. The northwest corner of Barad-dûr's upper section accumulated fracture lines in a pattern that a structural engineer would have found alarming and an architect would have found unprecedented. The tower cracked. It did not fall. It stood as it had stood since the Second Age, sustained by the ring power that the ring in Smaug's treasury was sustaining whether Smaug wanted it to or not. its foundations too deep and its construction too fundamental to be brought down by fire alone. The contraction from the nine's resonance accumulated across the passes. By the seventh pass it had moved from the left side of his chest to both shoulders, not debilitating, not close to debilitating, but present in a way that was information. The nine at full concert could do something to him, not enough, but something. He filed this accurately. On the eighth pass he did not exhale. He made the pass clean, at speed, at roof height, and pulled up into the northeastern climb and did not bank back. He climbed through the overcast and came out above the clouds into the clear cold air above Mordor's permanent weather, and the plateau was gray below him through the cloud layer, and Barad Doctor's upper section protruded above the clouds with its fractured northwest corner visible in the clear air, marked and standing. He turned north. The contraction in his shoulders eased as the distance from the nine increased, the resonance losing its coherence as the source receded, fading over the first 50 miles of the return flight to something that was present and would remain present. A permanent alteration, faint, the first mark that anything had ever made on Smaug's physical being that had not been made by himself. He noted it. He would not forget it. He added it to the ledger under the nine, under the specific heading of what they can do. In full concert, against me. Not enough, but logged. He crossed Mordor's western wall before dark and flew north through the night, the misty mountains finding him before dawn, and the northeastern plain opening below him in the gray morning, and the mountain ahead of him. Black and familiar and sealed, the only destination he had ever had. The pact was ended. The ledger was updated. The northwest corner of Barad Doctor bore his mark, and Sauron's finest instrument of psychic control had been detected in 1 second and answered in the only language that required no translation. He sealed the gate behind him and went to the treasury and placed himself between the ring and the southern wall and did not move for a long time. Outside, winter held the northeastern plain in the specific grip of a cold that had stopped caring about the things it covered. The world that remained was not the world that had been. This is true of most worlds after most wars, but it is usually true in the way of damage that can be assessed and addressed, repaired over generations, the record of what happened held in the shape of what was rebuilt. The world that remained after the Dragon King's 81st year was true in a different sense, not damaged in ways that repair addresses, but altered in ways that repair does not reach, because the things that had been removed were not structures or populations, but the organizing principles around which structures and populations had arranged themselves. The white tree was ash on the stones of the Citadel Court. The line of the kings of Gondor, the lineage of Inmenor running back through the Lost Island to the First Age of the world, carried forward across 3,000 years of the Third Age, in the specific fragile human mechanism of father to son, sustained by the marriages and the chronicles and the careful institutional memory of the stewards, had ended not in battle. Not in failure of nerve or character, but in the geometric fact that no provision in the architecture of Gondorian succession planning had accounted for an aerial assault conducted by a fire drake at 200 feet. Denethor, 26th steward, had died at his post. Faramir, his heir, had died in the evacuation. Aragorn, son of Arathorn, Isildur's heir, chieftain of the Dadain, the man who would have been Elisar Telconter in a different world, had spent the 81 years of the Dragon King's tenure operating in a north that had collapsed before the quest that would have made him king had time to conclude. He was alive. He was a ranger of a diminished people in a diminished country, competent and unrecognized, and without the specific sequence of events that would have placed him on the throne that no longer had a functioning kingdom beneath it. Minas Tirith stood. The lower tiers were intact. First and second levels, the deep foundation stone. The population of the city and the Pelennor farms in the lower quarters, surviving and organizing in the way that populations survive and organize when the alternative is not surviving and not organizing. A council had formed in the third month. It had no formal authority and considerable practical authority and met in the second-level market hall, which had a roof and was large enough to seat the relevant parties. The council did not have a name yet. Things that have just started do not usually have names until they have continued long enough for the name to seem necessary. The White Tower's upper sections were open to the sky. Wind moved through the tower's top floors in the specific way of wind, through structures that were not designed to be open, finding acoustics, generating sounds that the tower's designers had not intended, and that the tower's remaining population found, in the first weeks, unsettling and subsequently began to stop noticing. Which is what people do with the sounds of the world they are living in. Rivendell held. Elrond's ring, Vilya, the Ring of Air, greatest of the three, had maintained Imladris through the northern campaign in the way that it had always maintained it, not with walls and garrison, but with the quality of the place itself, the sense of sanctuary that Vilya projected outward from its bearer into the valley and the water and the stone of the Bruinen's banks. Smaug had not come for Rivendell specifically. It had not been high in the Nazgul briefing's target priorities, and the briefing had noted, accurately, that Elrond's valley was defended in ways that did not resolve to a conventional military assessment. Smaug had noted this and moved on to targets with clearer geometric solutions. Rivendell's halls were full. The Cinder and Wood elves of Thranduil's company were there, 3,000 of them, occupying the eastern wings in the specific careful coexistence of guests who have been in residence long enough to have opinions about the arrangement and the hosts who have had guests long enough to have opinions about the guests. The survivors of the Iron Hills were there, 840 dwarves. Din's count, living in the lower levels with the specific dwarven adaptation to underground space that makes them as guests simultaneously easy to house and difficult to maintain productive relationships with. Men from the Bjorning settlements were there, displaced populations from the northern vales, from the Anduin crossings, from the roads between the mountains. Rivendell was a refuge for the survivors of every civilization Smaug's tenure had ended or diminished. Elrond administered it with the patience of a being who had been doing this since the Second Age, and had, at various points in his history, administered refuges for the survivors of even more comprehensive destructions. He did not express despair. He did not express hope. He administered. Thranduil was in Rivendell. He occupied a set of rooms in the eastern wing's upper level and held his own council and went to Elrond's table when invited, and did not go when not invited. And he wore his crown at formal occasions, and kept it in his quarters otherwise, and he was every day and in every visible way the king of a forest that a dragon had sealed, and a people that were intact, and a tradition that would outlast. The current conditions, and whether he believed this or was simply performing it, was a distinction that, for the people around him, did not matter. Din did not wear a crown. He had never worn one. He sat at the fires in Rivendell's lower levels with the survivors of his army, and he sharpened his axe, regularly, with the methodical care of a man maintaining a tool against a future use he has not yet identified, but is confident he will find. The Shire rebuilt. This is the specific thing about the Shire that the history of the Third Age demonstrates across every difficulty that has approached its borders. It rebuilds, because its people are constitutionally oriented toward the activity of making things the way they were before. And they have the specific deep soil resilience of a population that has never experienced anything that required a fundamentally different approach to existence. The burned garden on the hill was cleared in the first spring. The scorched hill face regrew in the second. The round green door was rehung by the end of the second year. A new door, same color, same specifications, because the Sackville Bagginses had opinions about the door, and the door had always been green, and there was no reason, in their assessment, that it should be anything else. The field mice were in the root cellar. They had been in the root cellar since the November of the burning, and they remained there through the winter and into the first spring, with the easy tenure of creatures who assess available shelter by its immediate qualities rather than its historical associations. The root cellar was dry and had stored turnips within the past season, and its walls were earth, which is better for mice than stone. They did not know whose root cellar it had been. They did not need to. Smaug was in the mountain. He had been in the mountains since his return from Mordor, which was 81 years and 3 months ago, plus the weeks of the return flight. And he was in the mountain in the way he was always in the mountain, completely, finally, with no part of himself directed outward or elsewhere. The ring was beneath him, not at the surface of the hoard, not beside the Inmenrain coin, but under his body at the deepest point of his coiling, pressed between his underbelly and the gold below it, in the position that he had decided was correct when he returned from Barad Dûr and had maintained since. The ring was warm beneath him. He was warmer than the ring. The northwestern corner of Barad Dûr bore his mark, fractured stone, 60 feet of vertical crack in a wall that had stood for 3,000 years. Sauron was inside it. Sauron would remain inside it as long as the ring remained intact, which it would, because the fires in which it could be unmade were in the mountain to Smaug's east, and he had no reason to go there, and no one capable of asking him to. The equilibrium was stable. Neither of them could end the other. Both of them knew this. The knowledge was the arrangement, and the arrangement was what the world had become. No council gave the age its name. Ages are named afterward, by historians who require distance before they can perceive the shape of a period and find the word that fits it. If the historians had been there, if anyone had been in the position to perform the naming function with access to the full picture, they might have reached for several options: the Age of Desolation, the Age of the Dragon King, the Long Ruin. What they would have arrived at, given sufficient time and honesty, was the word that fit the texture of it: ash. Not as metaphor, as description. The color of Minas Tirith's upper courts, the color of the Bag End Garden in the first November, the color of the northeastern plain in the mornings, when the wind came west off the mountain and brought with it something finer than dust and older than the mountain's current occupation. The Age of Ash was what it was because it had no other name and no other appropriate word. It did not end. It continued. In the treasury, in the mountain, in the deep dark where the gold was warm from the body that had rested on it for 81 years, Smaug breathed. Slowly, regularly, the rhythm of a creature whose condition was complete, whose hoard was intact, whose territory was established, whose enemies were marked and contained. The marks the Nine had left on him had faded to something he noticed only when the season changed and the cold deepened, a faint residue of that deep resonance, present enough to remember and insufficient to matter. He had been marked. He had returned and sealed his gate and placed the ring beneath him and breathed, and the marks did not matter in the way that the marks on Barad Doctor did not matter. Recorded, permanent, insufficient, the fires in the treasury torches burned down across the night. They would need relighting in the morning, which was a task that required no one, because Smaug could relight them himself, and did. Each morning, with the same precision of exhalation that he brought to everything. 4 torches, left wall. The gold looked different in firelight, and the difference was worth maintaining. The ring did not speak again that night. If Smaug dreamed, his dreams were of fire, which is all a dragon's dreams have ever been, and all they will ever be. Until the world that Morgoth broke is finally remade into something the fire cannot reach. The mountain held. The darkness held. The gold was warm beneath him, as it had always been warm, as it would remain warm for as long as the mountain stood, and the dragon lay within it, and the age continued its long, quiet, ashen progress toward whatever came next. Nothing came next. Not yet.